Good evening, my dear student. Today, special work you have. I change my lecturing position. You have to special guest lecture, Jordan B. Peterson lecture. I download through the internet, that means YouTube, but you can't find it because it's like a series. I touch it. It's a point engage with your today subject. Then all of you join with it. I think it's sometimes 3 hours our lecture duration, but bit of the 10 minutes or 12 minutes, you have to wait for that. Okay, then shall you move it and watch it. I think you can take a perfect idea as well as, but you keep it your mind, had some examples and say, yesterday we discussed the another point and something, but you have to absorb what you need. Okay, move.
So I want to tell you, I'm going to make a little announcement first. I'm going to do a series of lectures, I think, starting in May, maybe at the Isabel Bader Theater. We're trying to look into booking that. I'm going to do a psychological interpretation of the Bible from beginning to end. That's the plan anyway. So I'm going to do that once a week. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend that you, maybe you're not, and that's fine, obviously, but if you go onto my Twitter account, you could just, there's a place you can sign up. It doesn't mean that you'll attend. I'm just trying to see if there are people who are interested in. I've been interested in doing that for a long time, and so I think I'm going to try it. So anyways, that's the announcement. And then, is that about it? I guess so. Okay, so look, we're going to switch gears today. The first half of this course, as you've no doubt already gathered, is because it's grounded essentially in clinical theories of personality, it tends more towards the philosophical. And I told you that the reason for that was that I regard clinical psychology as a branch of engineering rather than a branch of science. It's human engineering, obviously, and because of that, it's an applied science, and so that means it straddles the ground between a science and a practice. And because it involves human beings, it necessarily involves value because we live inside value structures, and so the logical consequence of that is that investigation into the philosophy of value is necessary in order to understand clinical psychological theories. Because really what you're trying to do as a clinician, you could say you're trying to do two things. One is to help people have less terrible lives, but you're also trying to help them have better lives. And there's obviously a value structure that's inherent in that attempt, because you're moving from something of less value to something of more value. And so, and it's best to just face that and all the complexities that come along with that head on. Now, I think what you do as a clinician to overcome whatever tendency you might have to impose your value structure on someone is you do an awful lot of listening. And so my basic practice with people is to say to them, well, obviously you're here because you would like things to be better, but that's okay. We can use your definition of what constitutes better. We can use your definition of what constitutes worse. Or we can establish that through dialogue and negotiation. What are you aiming at? How would you like things to be better a year from now, say? If you could have what you wanted, if your life was put together, what would that look like? And you can have a very straightforward discussion with people about that if you're not trying to cram the way that they're orienting the world into your particular perspective. Now, that's one of the dangers of being the adherent of a given psychological school. Now, having said that, it's also, there was research done many years ago showing that if you were an eclectic psychotherapist, which means that you sort of pick and chose from different psychotherapeutic schools, you tended to not be as effective as you were if you were the dedicated adherent of a given school. And I think the reason for that is that there's so many schools of psychological thought that if you say that you pick and choose from all of them, what that really means is that you don't know anything about any of them. And then there's also the additional factor, maybe you might call it, that if someone comes to you and they're very chaotic and confused, helping them impose any structure onto their life is likely to be an improvement over no structure at all. And you could think about that in a Piagetian sense, is that, you know, you're going to be happier playing a game rather than no game. And there's many games that you could play that are better than no game. And so if you go to a therapist that has a particular viewpoint and they help you structure your understanding of the world within the confines of a given clinical model, and you came in there very chaotic and uncertain, then maybe that's going to be a lot better for you than just floundering. And I think there's some real truth in that. And I think that's part and parcel of the same, of another, what you might call it, reasonable observation about maturation, is that it's very necessary for people at some point in their life to dedicate themselves to a single game of some sort, which is kind of what you're doing in university. You know, you have to become one thing at some point in your life. And the sacrifice, of course, is that you give up all the other things that you could become, but you don't really have a choice, because if you don't decide voluntarily to become one thing, you know, to become a disciplined adherent of some specific practice or profession or viewpoint, then you risk just aging chaotically, and you don't get away with not aging. So you might as well age into something that's actually something, rather than just remaining, or then just becoming an old child, which is really not a good thing. It's not a good thing to see, especially by the time people hit about 40. It's not pretty for them or anyone else. And even at 30, it's getting pretty old at that point. 40, it's like it's almost irreparable at 40. And the reason for that is you start running out of opportunities. When you're young and stupid, people don't care, because they think, well, you know, whatever. You've got decades of possibility still ready to unfold in you. But if you're in the same unspecified position at 40, people are much less forgiving, especially because if they're going to hire someone who doesn't know what's going on, or employ them, or engage them in some sort of productive activity, they might as well take a chance on someone young and full of potential, rather than someone who's really lived more than half of their life already, because of course you have by the time you're 40. Okay, so anyway, so that's with regards to putting the first half of the course to bed, so to speak. The second half is more scientific. And there's a bit of a gap, and it's a gap I'm trying to resolve conceptually, because now we move into more biological models and into models that are psychometric. And psychometrics is the psychological study, or the study of psychological measurement. And now if you're a scientist, there's a couple of things that you're obliged to do if you're a scientist. One is to utilize the scientific method. That's usually the experimental method, where you take two groups, randomly selected, apply a manipulation to one of them and an equivalent manipulation of a different sort to another, hypothesize about what the outcome is likely to be, and then test it. That's the technical experimental model anyways. You're also obliged as a scientist to come up with a measurement of your to come up with a measurement, let's just put it that way, that's reliable and valid. Okay, and what a reliable measure is one that measures the same way across multiple measurements. So for example, you wouldn't want to take a ruler that's made out of flexible rubber to measure things with, because it wouldn't give you the same measurement if you put it in different situations. That's reliability, and it's a term you need to know. It means that the measurement tool produces stable results across different instances of the measurement. Without that, you don't have a measurement. The other critical factor with regards to a measurement is that it has to be valid, which means that it actually has to measure what it purports to measure, and it has to be usable for an array of different purposes as a consequence. And so you might think, well, the purpose of scientific endeavor is to predict and to control. You could say understand, predict, and control, but understanding, prediction, and controls are all manifestations of the same underlying thoroughly designed comprehension. Now, here's what's happened with the measurement of personality. It's a funny story in some sense, a peculiar story, because in many ways what we've come to understand about personality from a scientific perspective developed in a very atheoretical manner. It's not very common in scientific endeavor that occurs, is that what we know about personality emerged from, I would say, statistically rigorous observation, without it being the consequence of any real model. So often what happens in scientific endeavor is that someone generates a model first, a theoretical understanding, and then they generate measurement tools based on that theoretical understanding, and then they test the measurement tools to see if the measurement tools perform properly, and if they fail at least to invalidate the underlying theory. That isn't what happened with psychometrics, except in a loose way. So here's the loose theory, and you've got to get this exactly right to understand this properly. You've got to get it exactly right. And it's really important because insofar as you guys are interested in psychology, especially in the experimental end of psychology, measurement is everything. And so much of what psychologists publish and write about is incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is because they do not have their measurements properly instantiated. It's a massive problem, especially in social psychology. In fact, it's probably a fatal problem in that most of the things that social psychologists measure don't exist. And social psychology has been rife with scandals for the last 4 or 5 years. And there's good reason for it. But a big part of the problem is that the measurement, that people are not stringent and careful enough about their measurements. So we're going to walk through this very, very carefully. So I'm going to set forward a set of propositions, and you have to think about them, because each of them they're axiomatic. So you sort of have to accept them before you go on to the next step. And there's certainly room to question them. But here's the bare bones of the psychometric model of personality. So we'll call it roughly the Big Five model. And the reason it's called the Big Five model is because the psychometric investigations have indicated that you can specify human personality along 5 basic dimensions. You might ask, well, what exactly is personality? And well, that's partly what we've been trying to wrestle with the entire course so far. And I would say, or what exactly is a trait? Think of a trait as an element of personality. And I think the best way to think about a trait is as a sub-personality. So you're made up of sub-personalities that are integrated into something vaguely resembling a unity, but the unity is diverse. There are describable, stable elements that characterize you, that are elements of your being. So for example, here's some common ones. I might say, well, are you social or would you rather be alone? So here's a good question for you to decide whether you're extroverted or introverted. It's pretty straightforward, because that's the first major dimension. Basically, if you take any set of questions about any set of questions that could be applied descriptively to a human being, and you subject them to a statistical process called factor analysis, you can determine how they group together. So what I would be interested in, let's say I asked you 100 questions. Let's say I asked 100 questions of you and 100 other people. What I would find was that reliably, if some person answered question A, say on a scale of 1 to 7, 6 or 7, there would be other questions in the set of questions that they also tended to answer on the upper end of the scale. Or reliably, if they answered one question at the top of the scale, they'd answer another question at the bottom. That's a pattern of covariation. So you're looking for how the questions covary across large numbers of people. So let's say, here's a stupid example, but it's really straightforward and easy to understand. I might say, how often do you smile? 1 to 7. How often are you happy? 1 to 7. Well, what you'd find, obviously, is that people who tended to answer that they smiled a lot would also tend to answer that they were happy a lot. And so smiling and happy are not exactly the same thing, which is why we have 2 different phrases to describe them. But they're close enough so that they seem to be reflective of some underlying structure. And so that's what a factor analysis does. It allows you to take a large set of questions, to administer it to a large number of people, and then to statistically analyze it, looking how the questions relate to one another across the entire group, so that you can infer what the underlying structure is. And here's the question in some sense. If I ask you 100 questions, how many questions am I really asking you? Because you might say, well, do you smile a lot? Are you happy? Do you wake up eager to start the day? You say, well, is that one question asked 3 ways? Or is it 3 separate questions? And the answer is, well, if the answers reliably covary, then it's reflection of an underlying single dimension. Now, obviously, those questions are slightly different. Now, but they'll relate to one another stably. And so you can infer out the central stable factors. Now, it might be the case that, so here's an example. Because you might ask, how many stable underlying dimensions are there in any set of questions? If I ask you questions that relate to your capacity to manipulate abstractions, I'll find that there's one factor. So imagine you had an infinite library of problem-solving questions. Doesn't matter what they are. Capital of Georgia. Here's a sequence: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. What's the next number? Here's 5 patterns. And they transform predictably across the pattern array. Here's 5 alternatives that the next pattern might be. Pick that one. Here's 10 words. Tell me what they mean. Anything like that. Here's a mathematical operation. Compute it. Anything like that. Imagine you had a very large library of questions like that. Okay, an infinite library, and you took random sets of 100 questions from that library, and you gave those sets to 1,000 people. What you'd find was that people who, and the score, say you gave them 100 questions, and then you summed across all the items to see how well they did. What you'd find was that people who did very well on one set of items would do very well on another set of items, and very well on another set of items. And that would be the same for people who did badly. If they did badly on any one of the sets of randomly chosen items of abstraction, they do badly on the rest. That's basically IQ. That's all there is to it. So what IQ does is correct that for age. But other than that, that's all there is to it. And the thing that's interesting about those random sets of abstract problem-solving questions is there's one dimension. That's it. Intelligence has one dimension. And it's one of the most terrifying statistics that are known to social scientists. And IQ is an extraordinarily powerful predictor of long-term success, especially in complex jobs. And the reason for that, it's quite straightforward. Most complex jobs throw random sets of complex problems at you. That's their definition. So for example, if you're working as a lawyer on complex court cases, you have to be able to read very quickly, you have to be able to abstract, you have to be able to problem solve, you have to be able to formulate arguments, and you have to do that repeatedly in different ways across very large spans of time. And so the fact that your ability to solve any set of random problems is a really good predictor of your ability to solve any set of random legal problems, it's more or less self-evident that that would be the case. But the thing is, the thing that makes IQ so damn powerful, and it's one of the personality traits, roughly speaking, the thing that makes IQ so powerful is you can basically get a decent measure of it in 20 minutes. It's very terrifying. Anyways, we'll go into IQ in some depths as we progress through the course. But you get one dimension out of a factor analysis of IQ. Now, in the personality domain, using descriptive items, you don't. You get 5 dimensions. And and what are these dimensions exactly? Well, you could think about them as, I think of them as sub-personalities. But here's some other ways of thinking about them, because we want to flesh this out a little bit. You could think of them as a frame of reference, so that if you're an extrovert, and I was going to tell you the extroverted question, does being around groups of people make you energetic, or does it exhaust you? And if you're the sort of person that, will go to a party and interact with 20 people, and then you have to go home and be by yourself for like 2 weeks, then you're introverted. Introverts are exhausted by social interactions. Extroverts are the opposite. They're energized by social interactions. And you might be in the middle, so that you can take it or leave it with regards to social interactions, but you're happy to go to them and you're happy to spend time by yourself. But a real extrovert, there'll be some of you in here. How many of you can't stand spending time alone? Okay, so there's only 2 that will admit it. Extroverts are more likely to admit that sort of thing too, by the way. And how many of you like to spend time alone, or would rather be alone? Okay, so there's a preponderance of introverts in this class, by all appearances. But that's a pretty canonical question for extroversion versus introversion. It's a very stable trait, by the way. It manifests itself early in life, and it's stable across the age span. Not completely. Introverts can learn to be extroverted. Extroverts can learn to spend time on their own. I think that actually your capacity to expand your ability past the initial constraints of your biological temperament is something like the development of character or wisdom. So if you're an introvert by nature and you learn how to be extroverted, then that expands your domain of competence. And if you're extroverted and you learn to be introverted, the same thing. But it's almost like, imagine a distribution of introversion here, extroversion here, a normal distribution. You're set, when you're young, at somewhere along that distribution with some range around it. And I think what you do as you mature, if you develop your skills, is you expand that range, but the place at which you're set doesn't move that much. So, okay, so you can think about them as sub-personalities. You can think about them as frames of reference. So frame of reference would be something like, well, since you're extroverted, you value being with people. And so you're going to look at the world. For example, if you're extroverted, you come into a room like this, you think, oh, look, it's a whole field of opportunity for social interactions. And if you're introverted, you think, well, maybe I'll go sit up in the corner and hope everybody leaves me the hell alone. But so it's an a priori set of perceptual structures that you bring to bear on a whole sequence of environments. So for example, maybe you're high in openness versus low in openness. That's the creativity dimension. People who are high in openness tend to be artists and entrepreneurs. And open people will look at other people as opportunities to engage in interesting intellectual conversations. And so you can tell when you're talking to someone open, especially if they're very high in openness, because they're going to want to talk to you about ideas or about aesthetics. That's what it's going to go right away. So that's how they view you, as a source of that sort of conversation. That's how they view the landscape. Someone who's high in neuroticism, which is a negative emotion dimension, is more likely to view the world as a place of threats to be protected against, because they're more anxious and more prone to emotional pain. So anyway, so that's the frame of reference issue. So there's something about your underlying fundamental psychological traits that determine, or influence at least, your value structures, and they do it at the level of perception. They also tend to set your goals. So extroverted people have as one goal the opportunity to engage with other people. So extroverts love parties. They live for parties. They love to tell jokes as well. That's a very good behavioral marker of extroversion. And so because they value those sorts of things, they set them as goals in their life. Or you could say the extroversion operating within them sets them as goals within their life, depending on how deterministic you want to be about it. So their patterns of behavior, that's another, at a micro level. You know, I showed you that sort of hierarchy of value / frames of references that ranged from micro behaviors up to high order abstractions. You can extract out personality by looking at people's micro actions as well. And one of the papers that I want you guys to read that's on the course website has to do with our investigation into behavioral markers of the big 5 traits. Yep. Maybe. We don't know exactly. I'll get back to that. At the moment, that's kind of what it looks like, is that introversion is something like the absence of extroversion. But let me explain extroversion more particularly. It'll make more sense. Okay. All right. So you can think about them as stable motivations. So for example, people who are high in agreeableness, I can generally tell people who are high in agreeableness when they come into my clinical practice and I start asking them about their biography. Because my experience has been that people who are agreeable will tell you their biography defined by relationships they've had over their life. So agreeable people are high in compassion and high in politeness. It looks like the maternal dimension. It looks like the pair bonding dimension, something like that. And so agreeable people tend to characterize their lives in terms of the intimate relationships they've had. And so those are also people who would value an intimate relationship over anything else, if agreeableness is the uppermost trait that characterizes their personality. Then, well, systems of values, we already talked about that a little bit. The higher you are in a given trait, the more you value certain opportunities that are associated with that trait. And so I think it's worthwhile thinking about traits along using all of those different conceptual schemes to understand what constitutes a trait. But what people are, in some sense, is a little melody of traits. Melody, not M-A-L-A-D-Y, although some people are like that, but melody like a song, you know, where different amounts of each of the canonical traits operate to a different degree in each person, and the person that manifests themselves is the panoply of those traits as they manifest themselves in the world. And so it's actually very useful to understand your big 5 traits as far as I'm concerned. Actually, that's why I have you do that exercise that you're supposed to do for this class that helps you identify your faults and virtues. And I used big 5 terminology to help you do that. So Part of the reason it's useful to know what your traits are is because it can help you figure out how you should orient your life. Like, so for example, if you're high in extroversion, you've got a proclivity towards sales, for example, and you're going to like occupations where you have a lot of opportunity for social interactions and social networking. You're not going to be happy if your job requires you to sit alone for extended periods of time and work in the absence of social interaction. You're going to be one of those annoying people then in one of those offices that instead of sitting alone in their office is going from doorway to doorway, engaging everyone in conversation, right? So, and you want to be in a position that capitalizes on your traits, because it's really difficult to work contrary to your traits. The other thing that's worth thinking about too, we're actually building a computer app for this, which has been about 80% done for a whole year. We've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right, but I think I've got it about right. What that means fundamentally, just so you have some sense of how large an effect that is that if you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. So it isn't so much that industriousness makes them happy or fills them with positive emotion. That would be more extroversion, right? Because extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. It's that industrious people can't stand sitting around doing nothing. And this is speculation, but human beings are obviously always engaged in the exchange of labor, especially the reciprocal exchange of labor. And you can imagine that in a community where everyone knows everyone, the people who work hard are going to be pretty irritated on a fairly chronic basis with the people who are completely unproductive. And my suspicions are that plenty of people who were completely unproductive in the history of the evolution of our species were wiped out by people who were unhappy with their lack of productivity. And so I think, generally speaking, human beings have this sense of ethical obligation with regards to one another to share labor. And people who are conscientious really feel that. So they feel bad if they're not busily working on something that's productive all the time. And so the advantage to being with someone conscientious is, well, they're going to work like mad, but the disadvantage is they're going to work like mad. So, you know, if you're looking for a partner that you want to relax with or have fun with, or who isn't uptight, then a conscientious person is probably not a very good choice. On the other hand, if you're a conscientious person and you're living with someone who's really unconscientious, that's good because they might be able to help you relax, but you're not going to be happy with them because they don't work nearly as hard as you do. But even worse, on the orderly dimension, you know, some of you have had roommates and maybe you're more orderly than your roommate. What does it mean? It means you're annoyed by mess before they are. And you don't have to be annoyed by mess much before your less orderly roommate for you to be the one that's always running around picking things up. And so actually one of the things that's emerged from the psychometric analysis is that women are slightly more orderly than men. And I suspect that has something to do with the, what would you call it, inequitable distribution of housework. Because even if imagine that your proclivity is to be triggered by disorder 25 seconds before your partner's. Well, you're going to end up, it doesn't take much difference for you to be the one that's always concerned about the mess first. So anyways, and so if you're a really orderly person and you live with a disorderly person, well, good luck getting along with them. They're going to regard you as like uptight and over concerned with details and unwilling to relax, that's for sure. And they're going to regard you as, well, just a bloody mess. And how can anyone possibly live with someone like you? And so another reason why it's useful to understand your personality is because I think it gives you a better crack at finding someone that you can actually live with over the long run. And we don't know what the optimal, I don't think you want to live with someone who's exactly like you, because then both of you have the same strengths and weaknesses. And there's a bit of a problem there, right? Because maybe an agreeable person can use a bit of a disagreeable person around them to balance each other out, and vice versa, right? So we don't understand the optimal balance for long-term thriving in a relationship, but I think we do understand the fact that if you're too different in your traits, that where you're different is going to constitute a chronic source of conflict. So anyway, so you can think about that. So, all right, so how have psychologists studied personality? Well, I'm going to talk most about the statistical psychometric approach to begin with, but there are other approaches that we will talk about as well. So let me give you the background on the self-report methodology first, because it's really formed the backbone of psychological research into personality. So imagine that you took a comprehensive sample of all the descriptive adjectives in the English language. Now, it's trickier than you think, because actually what constitutes an adjective isn't that easy to determine, because many words have forms that are adjective, verb, and noun, depending on how the same word is written out. So distinguishing adjectives from verbs or adverbs turns out to be more difficult than you might think. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you could collect all of the descriptive adjectives in the English language, and that then perhaps you decided, because you don't want to use all of them, you decided that you were going to use the most common 1,000 of them. And there are tables that enable you to look up the frequency of words. And it turns out that in common parlance, it's like 5% of the vocabulary of English language accounts for 95% of the usage. It's an example of this phenomena called the Pareto distribution, which we will talk about later. So, in fact, most discourse is done with 500 words. You can get about 80%, something like that, of speech in terms of single word comprehension with 500 words. So let's say you took you took all the descriptive adjectives, and then you took the ones that were the most common 1,000. And so here's the hypothesis part. And this is a critical thing to know. This is called the linguistic hypothesis. And the linguistic hypothesis is that variation in personality among human beings is of sufficient import so that it's become accurately coded in the lexicon. So what that means is that, roughly speaking, is that over the course of the evolution of any language, we'll use English as the example here, descriptive terms have been generated that actually do cover the variation in personality and that essentially cover them without bias. Now, that's a hypothesis. Actually, it's an axiom. It's because the hypothesis is, in some sense, it's not exactly testable. We'll leave that aside for now. It's testable a little bit, but not easily. So that's the first thing you have to accept. You have to accept that it's possible to extract out what constitutes personality by looking at the linguistic representation of descriptors insofar as they're encapsulated in language. Okay, so when people talk about trait models like the Big Five being comprehensive representations of personality, that isn't exactly what they mean. And you need to know this. What they mean is that it's a comprehensive representation of personality insofar as personality has been encapsulated in language. There may be elements of personality that we haven't been able to talk about or we don't know how to talk about that are of crucial importance. And there may not be, but the Big Five theorists assume that there aren't. All right, so that's a limitation of the theory. But if you accept that, then you say, well, the first thing you want to do is take a relatively random cross-section of the descriptive terms, because then you don't introduce bias into the initial stages of the inquiry. So, Matt, I'll tell you something that we did recently, and you can tell me what you think about it. It's analogous. We were trying to study political correctness. And so the first thing we were trying to figure out was, is there even such a thing? Because if you look at the political dialogue, what you find is that people on the side of the political spectrum who have been defined as politically correct tend to say that it doesn't exist and that category is just a pejorative term that was invented by people who hold alternative political opinions. And so the first question is, well, what do you mean does it exist? What do you mean by exist? How do you tell if a psychological concept is real? Like, is anger something that exists objectively? Is it an objective phenomena? Well, it's not that easy to determine. You say, well, we act like it is, and we understand what anger means, but no one goes around in the world and says anger, without saying anything else, or you'd run away from them, What they do is they place the word anger into a sentence and place the sentence within a conversation, and they enable you to infer exactly what they mean by the word anger by listening to the surrounding context, right? And if you're going to turn that into something like an objective term, what you do is you pull out the term anger, and then you make the hypothesis that it represents something real in the objective world. But it's not that easy to determine if something does exist, especially if it's a psychological phenomena, in the real world. What do you mean by exist? That's the problem of construct validation, okay? So that's another term you really need to know if you're interested in experimental psychology, especially on the personality end. A construct is a representation of something psychological that hypothetically exists objectively. How do you establish its existence objectively? Well, does fear exist? No, you have the problem with all the emotional terms. Does joy exist? Does surprise exist? Does embarrassment exist? Does guilt exist? Shame? How are they related to one another? Guilt and shame, for example, seem quite similar to one another, right? And pain and fear and anger all seem to share the attribute of unpleasant and negative emotions. And so if something exists, it should be the same as some things and different from other things. And that's part of construct validation as well, to specify how the construct is the same as some things and different from others. Anger should be reliably distinguishable from joy, for example, because otherwise they're not different. And anger and fear should be somewhat the same if they're both negative emotions. And so it's extraordinarily complex to validate a construct. And so here's what we did with political correctness. And the reason I'm using the political examples is because that's an obvious place where self-serving bias can enter the scientific arena, right? So if I wanted to make a point about political correctness, or if I wanted to make a point about right-wing fascism, I could build my biases into the measurement instruments accidentally, and then they would produce as output what I put into them as input. And I want to protect myself against that if I actually want to do the scientific investigation properly. So what we did when we started to construct our measures of political correctness was employ a number of people to go through as many news sources as they could get their hands on to identify any attitude or behavior, roughly that had been described by anyone at all as potentially politically correct. So it was kind of agnostic. And we were trying to do it as randomly as possible, you know, to get as many news sources as we possibly could, so that we were sampling across the environment without bias. Okay, so then we came up with, I don't remember how many, couple hundred, maybe more, couple hundred items that were roughly indicative of what you might describe as political correctness. But that's not good enough, right? Because just because you have this random assemblage of items doesn't indicate at all that they're all measuring something that was similar. Right? That's just implicit. They're all called political correctness, but you don't know if those attitudes co-vary. And what that means is, if you held one attitude of that list, were you more likely to hold another or multiple others, right? So does the conditional probability of holding multiple items, is there a high probability of holding true multiple items simultaneously? Well, you figure that out with factor analysis. So what we did is we turned that into a questionnaire using different question types, and we administered it to several hundred people, and we did a factor analysis, and we found actually that there was such a thing as political correctness because the questions clumped together. People would reliably answer them in a patterned manner, but that there were actually two dimensions that were quite separate. So there isn't one political correctness, there seems to be two. And then we looked at the personality predictors and the IQ predictors and a variety of other predictors that would enable us to come to some understanding of the temperamental proclivity towards those political attitudes, if any. We knew already that political conservatives tended to be low in trait openness, that's the creativity dimension, and high in trait conscientiousness. Whereas political liberals tended to be high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting to know from a Big Five perspective is that your political proclivities are very powerfully influenced by your temperament. And so one of the things you can think about with regards to ongoing political discussions in the real world is that those discussions are actually attempts by people of different temperaments, one, to impose their temperamental viewpoints on the world, and two, to engage in a dialogue with people who are actually quite different than they are. So like conscientious people, like they value hard work, rules, order, reliability, integrity, and structure. And so they're dutiful. We analyzed what predicted military performance, for example, in the US Army. Overwhelmingly conscientiousness. It's not surprising, right? Because it's a very structured, rule-ordered, top-down, follow procedure sort of endeavor. Now the armed forces had problems with that to some degree because they were also simultaneously looking for people who could think independently on their feet. Because if you're in a battlefield, for example, especially if you're isolated from your command structure, there's going to be times when you have to make extraordinarily difficult decisions on your own. But if you're selected primarily for conscientiousness, that's not going to be your forte, because if you're a conscientious person, what happens is that you enter into a contract with someone, even yourself, and then you carry it out. So now we've also spent a lot of time selecting entrepreneurs. I work with this company in California that has started schools for entrepreneurs in 160 different countries all over the world. The guy who started this, whose name is Hideo Resi, he's an absolute monster. The guy started, he started all those schools in 5 years, 165 schools in all across the world, 8 different languages. And we've been screening people for entrepreneurial ability. And if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you almost have the opposite profile as a soldier. You're very high in openness and you're lower in conscientiousness, or at least conscientiousness is irrelevant. And the reason for that seems to be that, like, if you're an orderly person and you like to follow procedures and rules, it's kind of hard for you to start a company, because when you first start a company or engage in any other creative process, because entrepreneurs turn out to be the same as artists, you kind of have to, you're not operating within a rule-governed structure. In fact, there may be many times where you have to break a small rule to move properly at a higher level of analysis. There's no algorithmic way of generating a new company, right? Obviously. And so it's people who are very high in openness who happen to be good entrepreneurs. And so this is something I thought was extraordinarily cool, because we'd also already known what predicts managerial, administrative, and academic ability. And IQ is crucial for any complex job. So we'll just leave that behind. But what predicts academic ability, for example, at the University of Toronto, is intelligence, obviously, but also conscientiousness. The correlation between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. 0. Right. But it's not surprising. The thing is, you know, it's easy to be cynical about that. But one of the things you have to understand about creative people is that they continually step outside of the domain of evaluation structures. Right? Because if you're going to say you're going to evaluate the performance of 100 professors on their lecturing ability, well, you kind of have to measure what's common across all the professors in order to come up with the standards for evaluation. Well, that means you're not going to be able to use that structure to evaluate a particularly creative professor because he or she is going to do something in a way that's so different that it won't show up on the evaluation measure. And of course, that's what happens in universities, you know. Somebody sent me, a couple of days ago, somebody sent me an essay that they had written for their master's thesis that was wildly creative, and they were basically told to leave the program. And that they couldn't continue. Not in a mean way. What happened was that what they were thinking was so outside of the conventions in the discipline is that no one had any idea what to do with the essay. So then that's really the lot of creative people, right? They're always stepping outside of evaluation structures. And so it's not that surprising that the relationship between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. We found out as well by looking at graduate student performance across multiple institutions that there was a negative correlation between creativity and graduate school performance. It wasn't even 0, it was worse than negative. Being creative was negative. And you think, well, that could make you cynical as well, but you can't be cynical in that way, because one of the things that happens in science is that science tends to progress incrementally rather than in great leaps. Now and then someone comes along who blows the structure out of a science and advances it ridiculously, like Einstein. But like, most people aren't Einstein, and maybe thank God for that. Most of the time, you're in a discipline, you understand the discipline, and then once you've developed understanding of the discipline, you know what the next micro question is that should be answered. And part of the reason that science is so powerful is because it allows people who aren't genius level creatives to make real advances in the generation of knowledge, one tiny micro step at a time. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 people doing it and each of them is making a micro step, man. We're zipping along as fast as we possibly want to zip along. And so it turns out to be conscientiousness that's the excellent predictor of graduate student performance. That's the best predictor for law. It's the best predictor for managerial positions. It's the best predictor for administrative positions. Anything that has a structure of rules that needs to be applied, conscientiousness is a great predictor. So, but it's not good for predicting artistic ability or entrepreneurial ability. And that's also really important, because one of the things, this is partly why bureaucracies stultify, right? Because what happens is as they develop, they get chock full of conscientious people, with a few psychopaths thrown in there just for good measure. They get chock full of conscientious people busily zooming efficiently down a single track, and then all of a sudden the landscape shifts and they're going very, very efficiently in exactly the wrong direction, and then the whole bloody thing falls apart. So you need to have some creative wingnuts in your organization to come up with completely absurd ideas that might just on the off chance be true. And so creativity is strange in that manner too, because it's a high risk, high return game. You're a lot safer in your life to find a functioning entity and to operate as a cog within it, as long as the entity keeps functioning. Because if you're creative and you go off on tangents all the time, there's some probability that one of those tangents is going to be exactly what is needed at the time, and you're going to become hyper successful as a consequence. But there's much more probability that even though some of your ideas might be highly valuable, the probability that this is the right time and place for them is extraordinarily low. So to produce a successful creative product, for example, in the marketplace, you need a ridiculous combination of creativity so that you keep generating ideas, and then a network around you of people who have skills that you don't, and then the production of a product, let's say, whatever that happens to be, that's actually in demand by the marketplace at exactly that moment, and that someone else hasn't already done better. So the sensible thing to tell anybody who wants to be creative is, that's stupid. You shouldn't do it. Your probability of success is so low that it's better just to do something sensible. But the problem with that is that creative people can't do that because they're creative. And if they shut down their creativity, it's like an extrovert who's gone to live in a, you know, in an isolated cell. A creative person who isn't being creative, they just wither and die. So they're stuck with it. So, but it is a high risk, high return strategy. So probably better if you want to be creative, or if you are, and you should take this advice to heart because I've been watching people for a long time. If you want to engage in a creative pursuit, you should find something stable to do that will generate you an income, and you should pursue the thing that you're creative about on the side, because monetizing creative production is so bloody difficult that, especially now, like especially in like artistic domains, generation of music and that sort of thing, it's like you just have no idea how many million songs there are on the internet, and the vast majority of them commercially available get downloaded 0 times. Like I think there's 80 million songs or something like that on the net, and I believe it's something in the neighborhood of 70 million get downloaded 0 times, and then there's 100 that can get downloaded like 350 million times, and so those people are wildly successful and everyone else collapses in failure. Yep. No, we'll talk about that more. Okay, so that's not a bad overview for initial foray into psychometrics. I started to talk to you about trait theory, and now I'm going to make a jump to biology. And that's a strange jump in some sense, because the two levels of analysis are relatively disconnected. But what's happening right now at the sort of outer echelons of personality research is that the workers at the forefront of the field are trying to integrate what's being established at the statistical level of analysis with what's known at the psychobiological level. And so this emerging science is known as personality neuroscience, and it's developed in a rather strange way, because the traits that were identified that I discussed with you on Tuesday, the big 5 traits, all emerged as a consequence of the statistical analysis of descriptors, characteristic mostly of the English language, although it's been duplicated in other languages. So in some sense it was an atheoretical model, right? It just came out of the linguistic data. So there was no real initial inferences about brain area or neurological activity or anything like that to drive the formulation of the Big 5 model. Instead, the Big 5 model came first, and then people started thinking, okay, can this be put into alignment with what we know about the brain? And so people have been hitting that pretty hard, I would say, over about the last, it's probably 30 years, something like that, because Hans Eysenck and his student Jeffrey Gray were pretty far along on this kind of thinking by, say, 1982, when Gray published his book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which the paper you're reading now, a model of the limbic system and basal ganglia, applications to anxiety and schizophrenia. That's a very short summary of the book that Gray published in 1982, which has been incredibly influential. If you're interested in going on in psychology, especially on the scientific end, but I would say pretty much regardless, if you're interested in going on in psychology, that's a very useful book to tackle. There's a newer version. It was published by Gray and McNaughton in, I think, 2000, something like that. It's hard going. Like, and you may have found the paper that way too. Gray was a very, very, unfortunately he died a few years ago. He was a very, very smart person. And he knew the animal literature on behavior, neuroanatomy, and neuropsychopharmacology inside out and backwards. And so whenever he defined a term, he always made sure that the term was intelligible at a behavioral level and at an anatomical level and at a pharmacological level. It had to, you know, the ideas that he were developing had to make sense at these multiple levels of analysis before he would accept them as genuine. And Gray did a remarkable job of extending our knowledge of the biological and evolutionary basis of at least the first two personality traits, say extroversion and neuroticism, roughly corresponding to positive and negative emotion. So, so that's partly why you're reading Gray. And Gray's theory is also cybernetic theory. Cybernetic theory is a variation of a theory developed by an MIT cognitive scientist named Norbert Wiener, who was an early AI, artificial intelligence researcher, and he proposed that intelligent entities were goal-directed and that they organized their behavior around reducing deviations from a goal while they were approaching it once they had decided what it would be. And that's also proved to be incredibly influential. We'll talk a fair bit about cybernetic models as we progress. So Gray is sort of a combination of artificial intelligence, cybernetic theorizing, and then an incredible amount of data that's come in from animal behavioral research. And as far as I'm concerned, most of the things that we know about the brain have been derived from animal research. The animal researchers tended to be extraordinarily careful scientists. They were influenced by B.F. Skinner, who established the sort of the initial theoretical basis for understanding how animals learn. We'll talk about that a little bit next class. So anyways, that's the context within which Gray is working. Ledoux, these are all papers you're going to read except the third one, which is optional. Ledoux is also an emotional, he's an affective neuroscientist, so he's someone who studies emotions, mostly again animals. And Ledoux has done a lot to sort of add some of the pieces that were missing in Gray. Gray probably concentrated a little bit too much on a brain area called the hippocampus, which is the brain area that sort of lets you know if it's reasonable to be calm where you're currently situated. And so what the hippocampus does in some sense is compare what it is that you want to have happen with what is happening, and if the two things are the same, then you're calm. So it's a match-mismatch detector, and it has access not only to memory, but also to formulations of, say, the desired future. Swanson, I had people read the Swanson paper last year. I put it in your reading list as optional. It's worth hacking through if you can manage it. It's a very hard paper, though, which is why I took it out of the required reading list. The reason I like Swanson, we're going to talk a fair bit about him today, is Swanson's not a psychologist. He's actually a developmental I can never say this properly. He studies developmental anatomy. We'll do that. And so he's very interested in how the brain unfolds across time during embryonic development and then up into maturity. And so he understands the brain differently than a psychologist would, because a psychologist tends to analyze the brain, as a sort of mature thing, usually in adulthood. But for Swanson, it's a much more living and transforming system, and he's trying to set forth a schema for understanding brain anatomy and also associating that with function. And you might think that that's a well-advanced science already, that we know how to segment up the brain and we know roughly what the pieces do, but we haven't even really managed to establish the terminology properly yet. It's neuroscience is a very new field, and there's no limit to the number of things that we don't know about it, including even the basic classification structure. Now, Swanson has put forth a very intelligent basic classification structure, and part of the reason that I think it's so relevant to a personality class is because it maps in a beautiful way onto some of the things that we've already talked about, especially Piaget. So there's a nice direct mapping of Piaget's developmental theory onto Swanson's theory of neurodevelopment and then of neural function. And that's completely accidental, because Swanson never cites Piaget, so they're non-overlapping literatures. And I kind of like that, because if something pops up in one place with one method and pops up another place with a completely different method, especially if those two places are distinct in terms of their historical development, you might start thinking there's actually something there. It's sort of like seeing something and hearing it at the same time. You've got two independent sources of data. It's like triangulation in a sense. And so it was very exciting to me to come across this paper by Swanson. I think he's one of only two scientists I ever wrote a fan letter to, I mean, really, it's a brilliant paper. And then there's other reasons why it maps onto what we're going to talk about too, because Swanson also points out quite clearly the function of the, he kind of roughly separates the hypothalamus into two halves, and he points out that they have quite distinct functions, and the functions also map onto some of the things that we've been talking about in a very lovely way. And so there's a lot of reasons to go through Swanson's paper carefully. You know, it's like 50 pages long, but the guy put it, in some sense, his whole life's work is in those 50 pages. So, you know, even if it takes you 12 hours or 20 hours to read it, it's like, that's not too bad if you're going to extract out like 30 years of solid research. Gray's book is the same. Like, if you read that book, you've got, if you read it and understand it, you've basically got a fair chunk of neuroanatomy, a lot of animal behavioral analysis, so behaviorism in general, a lot of psychopharmacology, and a lot of understanding of the functional significance of the brain's major neurotransmitter systems. You can get all that from Gray's book. That's a killer book, you know, if you can extract all that out. So anyways, Carver and Shire also take a cybernetic perspective. Fundamentally, they're more cognitive scientists. You're going to find their paper a little bit farther down the road. But they're also very interested in how creatures, human beings in particular, select goals and then align themselves with those goals. And for our purposes, we're going to talk a fair bit about motivation today. And the distinction between motivation and emotion is not clear. They're both words that sort of function within a linguistic context. But for the sake of argument, and of course all the emotions aren't the same. It's not like there's one circuit that subsumes emotion. There's multiple circuits that subsume emotion, and they're not identical circuits, you know. So it isn't like every emotion is a variant of the same thing. It's not, and it's the same with the motivation. So they're very loose groupings, motivation and emotion. But for the purposes of our argument, we're going to make this case. Roughly, motivations set goals, and roughly, emotions orient you in relationship to those goals. Now, like I said, those categories overlap. Anger is usually considered an emotion, and it often has a goal, right? The goal is to hit something or hurt something. That's one possible goal. So emotions can segue quite easily into motivational states, but whatever. You got to use a category system of some sort to clarify things, and so that's what we're going to pursue. Motivation set goals. It's actually more complicated than that. You know, I showed you that little oval diagram with you know, desired future and unbearable present, so to speak. Motivations actually don't just set goals. They also prime behavior, and they also set up the perceptual frame within which you interpret the world. So for example, if you're hungry, it isn't just that you're driven to eat. First of all, eating is a very complex behavior, especially if it's associated with food preparation, say. The systems that you've used in the past to procure food and then to ingest it are sort of disinhibited by the motivational state, so they're at the ready. And then your sensory system is tuned so that it's going to focus on those things that are relevant to eating and tune out everything else. So the motivational state also does perceptual tuning. And then there's a felt component of it as well. So it's not reasonable to only say that motivation sets goals or that it drives behavior. It does three things: goal setting, behavioral driving, plus it provides a perceptual schema within which those other two things make sense. And so a motivated state in some sense is like a little micro-personality. It's only got one aim. It's sort of a one-eyed micro-personality, you know, so it's only aiming at one thing, but it still has all the other aspects of personality. So sort of, you know, for me that aligns nicely with the psychoanalytic idea that, you know, you're a loose aggregation of multiple fragmented personalities. You know, they're sort of coherently tied together at the highest level of analysis, but they can go off and do their own thing. You see that in situations, for example, like eating disorders, where the hunger system itself starts to become almost a spun-off part of the personality, and the rest of the personality then wars with that. And that's sort of, in some sense, that's like cortex versus hypothalamus. And you never win. Cortex does not win over hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what keeps you alive. So it's one of the things that keeps you alive. You could do without your cortex, but you cannot do without your hypothalamus. And the connections stretching upwards from the hypothalamus, which is a very old brain area, are much more powerful than the connections coming down from the cortex to modulate the hypothalamus. And that's another indication of just exactly who's in charge when the chips are down. You know, and that's why it's so hard for you to override your basic emotions or motivational states. It's like the system evolved to keep you alive, and it's not particularly willing to give up control, in a sense, given that your survival is staked on its function. So it's useful to know that, because you know, if you pursue psychology and you stay within the human side of psychology, say, instead of wandering off into the animal behavioral research, you'll see that most human psychologists and neuropsychologists are very corticocentric. They really like to think that it's the newly evolved parts of the brain that are in charge, and that's just not right. The newly evolved parts of the brain are in charge only when nothing is bothering you. Like, if you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not too excited, you're not too curious, you're not too terrified, you know, you're not too cold, you're not too warm, any of those, then the cortex is in charge. But if you deviate substantially across any of those dimensions, the probability that control over your behavioral output and your perceptions is going to devolve down the evolutionary hierarchy to more primordial brain areas is extremely likely. You know, and you see the same thing happens, you know, maybe you're having a discussion with someone, right? And they exhaust the limits of your rational knowledge, which means basically they out-argue you. Well, what happens? Well, usually what happens is that people cry or they get angry. And it's like they're out of cortex, it's bang, right down to the lower and more primary evolutionarily determined systems. So, okay, now we're gonna take a look at how the brain functions in general. And so we're going to start pretty general, and then we're going to go narrow. And the first thing that you might want to think about is, what problem exactly is the brain wrestling with? And the major problem is that reality is so complicated, it has so many layers and so many interconnected causal links that it's complex beyond comprehension. And that's a big problem. I mean, you think about all the subatomic complexity, that's a horrible thing. Then there's the complexity at the atomic level, and that's, you know, pretty overwhelming. And then there's the molecular level, which makes the atomic level look simple. And then there's all the exceedingly complex structures that emerge out of the molecular level, especially in living organisms. So that would be roughly at the organ level of existence, you know. And then there's you as a totality with your brain, and the brain is so much more complex than everything else in the universe that it's not even in the same category. So there are estimates, for example, by Gerard Edelman, that there are more connections in your brain, more patterns of connections in your brain than there are subatomic particles in the universe. So, you know, that's one major league complex thing, and there's lots of them around, and, you know, they're all integrated into families, and then, you know, roughly tribal groupings, some of which get large enough to be nations, and then that's all embedded inside of some biological system, and so on and so forth, all the way out to the limits of the cosmos. I mean, this is one complicated place, and, you know, your job in large part is to understand it, but also not to become overwhelmed by it, because you have to simplify it down to the point where you can sort of think about one thing and do one thing. And so you have to screen all of that out so that the complexity doesn't overwhelm you when you're attempting to do anything simple, even to look at yourself in the mirror, which is also a very complicated thing to do. Part of the problem your brain is always facing is, what can I ignore? And the answer to that is, well, you need to ignore almost everything, and that's a problem, because of course it's not always obvious what's okay for you to ignore. You know, and that changes on you suddenly too, because, you know, because you have imperfect knowledge, you might think something's irrelevant and it turns out to be of critical importance. It's a deadly difficult problem. And so one of the ways that we solve this is we're actually pretty blind to almost everything, you know. Our sensory input is limited by our physiological limitations, certainly. So there's, like, in terms of vision, we only see a very small little slice of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and it's the same with sounds. And, we can only touch things that are basically within our reach, and so that limits things substantially. And then there are also things we can't detect, like we're not very good at detecting, like we don't have the same ability that, say, platypuses and some fish can detect electromagnetic disturbances around them on their skin, and like there's senses that we don't have. So we're narrowed a fair bit by what it is that we're able to perceive. And we're actually narrowed in what we can perceive far more than anybody ever guessed. So I'm going to show you a little video here.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
So how many of you saw the gorilla? Well, no, let's do it the other way. See the gorilla. Okay. How many of you had known about this video beforehand? Yeah, the gorilla part of it. Yeah, so you guys don't count. Now and then, I get someone who's seen it before and they still miss the damn gorilla, so that's pretty funny. So, but of course, Dan Simon set this up because his original video got so popular, virally popular, that everybody has seen the invisible gorilla. And so, now he's showing you that, well, you think you're smart, you've been clued into how blind you are, and it turns out you're not any smarter than you were to begin with, right? So how many people saw all three things that changed?
I saw the video before, though.
Oh, you've seen it before. So, okay, and how many didn't? Yeah, okay, so the vast majority of you missed one or more of the things that changed. And they're not really trivial things, like the disappearance of a person from 6 people, that's fairly major, and the whole background changed color, and you might think you'd clue into that. And so the weird thing is, even when you're primed to notice what you're supposed to notice, which is to say count the balls, and you know that something weird is going to happen, that still doesn't prime you enough so that you can keep track of all the weird things that are happening. And like this was an absolutely staggering experiment when it was first shown. The psychologists were just like knocked over by it, because the hypothesis up to that point had been always that you could concentrate on what you were concentrating on, but if something anomalous or unexpected happened, your attention would be automatically devoted towards it. And of course that's what people would think, right? You'd think that if you're watching people play basketball and a gorilla walks into the, area and it's not small, that of course you'd be surprised and you'd see it. And it turns out that that's just wrong. And, it tells you a lot about how your nervous system is set up. So you're focusing on counting the balls. And so for some reason, getting the correct answer to the question, how many times is the ball thrown back and forth, turns out to be motivationally significant. Why? Like, why did you got the instructions, fair enough, but why did you listen to them?
Does it narrow your attention to the target?
Oh, sure it does, but the question is, why did you even comply with the instructions?
Because you want to get the answer right?
Yeah, who said that? Because you wanted to get the answer right. Why did you care if you got the answer right? Well, think about it for a minute. Like, guess.
That means you're smart?
Means you're smart. Yeah, that's right. So that's one possibility. It's like instantly you sort of interpret it as a little cognitive test, maybe, and then you want to see if you can do it. And, you know, so that taps into your hierarchy of values. Part of your value is I want to be maybe a smart and competent person, or I want to be at least as smart and competent as everyone else is playing this game. And so, you know, the instruction taps into a pre-existent value structure, and then it's motivating. Okay, so, yeah. What, compliance as well? Yes, that's another thing. It's like that, you know, the room in some ways is set up to ensure a degree of compliance, right? Because there's an implicit story in the room, which is if I'm at the front of it, and so that sort of makes me at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and the fact that you're here means you've already bought into that presupposition, and so it's a logical thing to do to play along with the game. So, yes.
Or it can also be that, like, when you're curious about what can happen if you get the answer right. 'Cause maybe
True, that's more like the playing a game issue, right? Is that, well, maybe something interesting will happen. Okay, right. Okay, so there's a variety of reasons why you might listen to the instructions, but the point is the instructions actually tap into your motivation, in your intrinsic motivation enough, so that you will in fact attempt to play the game. And then as soon as you play the game, what happens? Well, you focus your very limited attentional resources precisely on what it is that you're supposed to do. Now, we could talk a little bit about how the visual field is set up. So, you know, you notice that, like if I'm looking around the room, if I want to see you, all of you, I can't just stand here and look straight ahead. Because all you people over here, you're like, I can't see, if I'm looking straight ahead, I can't see the faces of anyone past here. And I can only see them sort of as blurs, and unless they move. And if they move up something, then I can see the movement, but I can't, it's not clear to me what's moving. And it's the same for the people over here. The only person I can really see right now is the woman who's sitting there in the white sweater. All the rest of you are like, and the person to the right, I can more or less, as long as I look at her, I can more or less see that he's dressed in gray, but I can't see his face at all. Now he nodded his head and I could pick that up. So what's very strange about your visual system, and your sensory systems are like this you know, all your sensory systems are like this, is that you have a tiny little point of focus where the information is rich, and that's partly because, so the center of your eye is the fovea, and it's most densely packed with cells, but more importantly, each of the cells in your fovea, which is the very center of your vision, you can tell when someone's pointing their fovea at you, because then you have the sense that they're looking at you, and human beings are unbelievably good at figuring out when someone is pointing their fovea at you. We can detect what would you call it? Deviation from direct gaze with an accuracy that's absolutely remarkable. Now each of those little cells in the fovea is connected, each of the one cells is connected to like 20,000 cells at the first level of the hierarchy of the visual system. And so the reason that your whole eye isn't fovea is because your head would have to be this big to manage it. So, you know, what's evolved is sort of a compromise, is that in the center of your vision, the center of your vision is very, very detailed. And then what you do is you zip that center around, like snap, 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 and your brain sort of makes a amalgamated picture out of all those little snapshots. And, you know, then it weaves it together so it seems to you like it's a continuous, a continuous movie of consciousness, even though it's really not. And then the sides of your eyes, the periphery of your eyes, well, they don't have the same potency as the fovea. And so they kind of play a triage game. It's like, okay, I can't see, if I'm looking straight ahead, I can't see everything. What might I use as an indication that I should move my gaze from where I'm looking to somewhere else? And one answer to that is movement. So the periphery is pretty good at picking up movement. And so often if you see movement in the periphery, then you'll move your foveal vision to where the movement was, and then, you know, then you can keep track of what's changing. So what your brain sort of assumes is that when you're looking at something, everything else is irrelevant, and it also sort of fades into the background. And so that's what's happening with the gorilla video. And so part of the reason you can't see the damn gorilla is because he's dressed in black like the players. And so when you're focusing on the basketball, all the black moving things look the same. You know, there's no distinction between them at all.
And then the background of the curtain, it's like, well, first of all, why would you be primed to see the curtain change color? Like, things just don't do that in real life, right? I mean, big objects don't suddenly change color, or very, very seldomly. So, and more importantly, the fact that the gorilla shows up, the fact that one player leaves, and the fact that the curtains change color has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not you can complete the task, right? So it doesn't matter if you ignore the information, and that's because it's irrelevant in terms of the interpretive frame, the motivated interpretive frame that you're applying to the scene. And so the rule for perception is don't pay attention to anything that isn't directly relevant to the desired outcome. Now, exactly how you calculate what you can pay attention to and what you can't, that's very complicated. I mean, you build that knowledge bit by bit over time, and you can be wrong about it too. But so the old idea was, you know, well, first of all, that you were very much conscious of the environment, period, which you're not. And then the second idea was, well, while you're being conscious of the environment, if anything changes radically, you will definitely focus your attention on it. And what turned out to be the case is, well, you're not very conscious of the environment, and radical things can happen, and you won't notice them unless they interfere with what you're doing. So something that emerges, that interferes with what you're doing, that you don't expect, you will instantly orient towards and concentrate on. So it isn't anomaly or novelty that attracts your attention. It's the unexpected disruption of the relationship between your behaviors and the desired outcome of those behaviors. And that's a much narrower claim. Only pay attention to things that make you fail. It's something like that. Or at least additionally pay attention to things that make you fail. And, you know, generally speaking, that's also associated with an emotional response, you know. So if you're doing something and you know, you think you know how to do it, and so you're doing it, and then all of a sudden something unexpected happens, you're going to have an emotional reaction. And we'll talk more about the emotional reactions in the next class, but the emotional reaction partly prepares you for the worst in case this unexpected thing is bigger than you think it is, and sort of also primes you to be curious and to start to explore, to figure out what it is, so that you can reconstruct your expectations and desires in accordance with the transforming world. So this slide is an elaboration in some sense of what I was telling you a little bit earlier about the multiple levels of reality, you know. So the idea is that the thing that you see, which in this particular schema would be the computer, is nested inside all of these systems, or has other systems nested inside of it. And that's part of an indication of the complexity of things. Now, you know, one of the things that you might think about, for example, if you're using your computer, one of the things you might ask yourself is, like, why is your computer a black rectangle or like a silver rectangle? It's all smooth and shiny. Why is that? You know, like, it's not clear first, it's not transparent, okay, and then it's got this smooth cover, and it wouldn't necessarily have to. Why do you think that's appealing to you?
Because it's familiar, sort of like a book.
Okay, so it's familiar, yeah, and that's good. So it's familiar. What else is? It's simple. Yeah, you don't want to interact with the computer at all. You want to interact with little pictures on the screen, and then you don't even really want to interact with those. You want to interact with some subset of what that picture is doing on the screen. And so you're very, very rarely using the computer, right? You're just paying attention to, well, let's say the screen and the keyboard. So the computer is whatever's underneath that, and then what that is a collection of parts that are so bloody complicated that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that are nested inside a whole network of things that are so complex you don't want to have anything to do with them. And so you know, what happens when you're using a computer is all of a sudden it stops working. Well, then it's a computer. As soon as it stops working, it's a computer. Before that, it was whatever it was you were doing. And as soon as it turns into a computer, what do you do with it? Well, you know, you stupidly hit the on and off button, and maybe you plug it in and you know, and out or something. Or maybe you check your switches to make sure that a fuse didn't burn out or a breaker go, and that's pretty much the end of you in terms of your ability to deal with the actual entity. You know, and then you curse with your primate brain, and then you send it out to be fixed. And so one of the things that's worth considering, because this will also help us understand what happens in terms of brain function as we go along, is that as long as things are going according to how you want them to go, you can really pretend that the world is unbelievably simple. All the world consists of is those few things that you're doing in your little bounded perceptual frame, and everything else is zero. And then, unfortunately, now and then, the hypothesis that everything else is zero is radically wrong, like when your computer crashes, and then you actually for a while have to deal with at least some of the complexity that's actually there, and that's usually extremely anxiety-provoking. So, you know, you can imagine the same situation is while you're in your nice smooth car, and you're on the highway, and all of a sudden, you know, you hear a horrible grinding noise, and smoke comes out of the back, and you're pulled over to the side. Well, what was merely a means of getting from point A to B in comfort, like 2 seconds ago, is now a collection of extremely troublesome parts, none of which you know anything about, plus it's disrupted your day, plus it's disrupted your pocketbook, plus you have to now deal with a bunch of people who are going to tell you what's wrong with your vehicle and maybe fix it for some completely unknown amount of money and with dubious utility. And so, poof, the car turns into that. And so it's almost impossible to overestimate the degree to which we live within a world that's bounded by our expectations and desires, and how much time we spend keeping everything that's complex away from us so that we don't have to deal with it. Okay, so now we might want to think about how we do that. I'm going to show you, this is a little schema that might be helpful. So, like, I made this little diagram of dots because I wanted to make an ambiguous figure. So, I'm hoping that when you look at that figure, what do you see when you look at it? The center. And what shape is the center? A cross. Okay, so you can see a cross. What else can you see? It's a rectangle. Yeah, what else can you see?
4 squares.
It's 4 squares. Yeah, exactly. So, and what else can you see?
18 triangles within those 4 squares. Made up of dots.
That's a good one. I haven't seen that one. I'll take your word for it, though. What else can you see? Well, I'll show you some of the things you can see, okay? You see that, right? You see that? See that? You can see that. You can see that. Okay, so the first thing that you might note is that the thing in the beginning, the thing in itself, let's say, you can see multiple ways. It's not exactly that you have an opinion about what it is. You know, it's that you can actually see those different things. You can see it manifesting those different perceptual objects. And that's a strange thing, because you know how people always think that arguments are about opinions. There's some facts, and you have one set of opinions about them, and you have another, and then you argue about the opinions till you get to the facts. Unfortunately, it's a lot worse than that, because the facts themselves are often reasonably subject to debate. So you might ask, for example, which of the 5 ways that you could see that initial thing is the right way to see it? And the answer to that, and this is a pragmatic answer, is it depends on what you want to do with your perception. You know, so if you want the highest resolution that captures as much detail as possible, then you want something as close to the thing in itself as possible. So that'd probably be object 5 there. You know, if you want to know the rough area, let's say that's a map of an orchard, you might think about object 1. If it's an orchard from the top, right, and you want it to walk from north to south, you might want to think about it in terms of object 3. You know, and so those are different ways you can perceive that object. And then I would say that what happens at the next level of abstraction, and that's where you've got the numbers and words down here, is that you have the thing in itself, which is complex and can be seen many ways. Then you have the things you see, which are partial, sort of low resolution representations of the thing itself. And then there are words which are, at least in part, references to the image of the thing. And so by the time you get to the word, it's pretty compressed. And I really like the metaphor of compression, you know, so, because a lot of the things you see are sort of like thumbnails. And why are thumbnails useful? You guys have done some, you know, image processing, say. Like, obviously a thumbnail lacks some things that a 16 megabyte, is that about right now? How big are cameras? 16 megabytes for a single photo? What's that? Yeah, well, I think the new cameras are up, I think they're up to 16, the newest iteration. So, okay, so why have thumbnail if you have a 16 megabyte picture? Okay, but why not use the picture? Because then it takes more time. Right, that's exactly it. Is that there's a trade-off between detailed representation and time utilization, time and resource utilization. And you know, like a computer, you guys have limited time and resources, and so you don't actually want to see any more than you need to see in order to get what you're supposed to get done. Because otherwise it's just a waste of energy. And so what that means is that your brain is always trying to figure out, in some sense, what's the simplest way I can represent this so that I can undertake whatever it is that I'm planning to undertake next. And that's sort of, again, from a philosophical perspective, that's actually something pragmatic. Okay, so then you might ask yourself, you organize your perceptions in relationship to your goals, and then you might ask yourself, well, where do those goals come from? You know, and we've heard from thinkers like, say, Freud, who talked about the id functions, and the id is sort of the seat of primordial impulses, right? And so you might think about the id as the producer of primary goals or drives, and Freud did think about them as drives, so they were things that led to, you know, a relatively rigid behavioral algorithm once the state had arisen. Now, as I mentioned before, I think that that's a flawed viewpoint, because the motivational state is more than merely a drive, because a drive is something that, say, triggers a pre-programmed sequence of behaviors. And a lot of the early behaviorists thought about animal behavior in that way, right? They'd say the animal would encounter a stimulus, and the stimulus would produce a response, and then the responses would get chained together, and then when the animal encountered the stimulus again, then just those chained responses would automatically run. And one of the famous experiments that showed that that was wrong was a rat was trained to run through a maze. You can sort of train a rat pretty quickly if, you know, you put him in the maze and there's like, he can go this way or this way, and you put some cheese over here. You do that 3 or 4 times, the rat learns to turn right, and then you add another piece to the maze, and, you know, then the rat learns to turn left, and so you can get it turning, you know, in an extremely complicated way to walk through the maze. But then what they did was they took a rat and they wrapped up its hind legs, you know, like with tape, so it couldn't use them, and then they put its little rear end on a cart, and then they had the little rat scoot through the maze on the cart. And it's obvious that a scooting rat and a running rat don't use the same motor output, not even close, and the rat could still get through the maze. So the idea that all the rat had done was chain together learned automatic responses turned out to be wrong. Rats, it's more like rats learn what's going on and can generalize from it just like you do. So anyway, so the notion that the drive just instantiates a sequence of pre-programmed behaviors, in most cases, in many cases, especially with complex behavior, turns out to be wrong. There's some limited circumstances under which it's right. Okay, so the first hypothesis we're going to entertain is the idea that you have to frame the world in order to interact with it. And this is sort of a little mythological diagram that I whipped up a long time ago. And the bottom thing, that's an Ouroboros, by the way, which is a dragon that eats its own tail. It's an ancient symbol of chaos. And chaos is what you see when you don't know what you're looking at. And so you could say, in some sense, chaos is all the complexity that surrounds you that could possibly intrude on your little safe world. And then to grasp that chaos or to operate within it, you have to put it within a framework. And so that's the great father there, that's actually God. You see, and God's got the sun behind him because God is like the sun. He's, you know, reliable, and he's associated with consciousness, and then he's sort of ruling over this city. And so for me, that was a good symbol of culture. And in part, culture is what's outside of you, but in part, culture is also the frameworks that you've learned to use by being with other people the frameworks that you've learned to use to narrow and specify the world. And in my mode of thinking, the framing is associated with security on the one hand, because it tells you what you can do and, you know, makes things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control and, you know, it can start to get too rigid. Whatever. Regardless of the pros and cons of framing, if you see something one way, then you can't see it another. It's harder to see it another. So that's the con side of framing. The pro side of framing is, well, then you get to do something. If it's unframed, you're in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead at all. So you have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really, in some sense, you even have to oversimplify them. It depends on what you mean by that. But what you're really trying to do is to never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So, how do you frame things? Well, the first thing we should point out is that a lot of framing doesn't even happen psychologically. Right? So here you are sitting in this classroom and you're not overwhelmed by chaos. Well, why? Well, first of all, you're in a city. That's helpful. There's electricity here and there's natural gas and there's people to fix all the plumbing. And so the fact that you're in a city makes life much simpler right off the bat. There's nothing trying to eat you. You don't have to contend with the fact that it's like minus 20 for 3 months. And, you know, so that's a whole bunch of complexity that the civilized world has just taken care of for you. And then, you know, now you're in the university in the city and that eliminates a whole bunch of other hassles, you know. There's some things you have to do, but there's a bunch of things you don't have to do. And then you're inside this building and, well, look at that. There's electric light here and, you know, and the chairs work and there's not going to be an earthquake and probably the whole building isn't going to fall down. So, you know, by the time you're sitting in your chair here also with your clothing on, you've screened a lot of complexity out already. And so you can sit there fairly calmly. And so that's all external. Now, part of the reason, and this is worth thinking about because this isn't only psychological. You guys will hear a fair bit about terror management theories as you progress through your education. And so terror management theories are theories that attempt to account for why people are, say, patriotic in their beliefs, why they adopt belief systems. And the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. And so Freud sort of said that about religious systems. That was his critique of religion. People are afraid of death, and so they have this infantile desire to have that fear go away, so they turn to religion, and religion says, well, death isn't permanent, and that's why people are religious. And the extension of that is, well, that's also why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against this deep, shaking anxiety. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your culture, say, if you identify with it, you're patriotic or whatever it is, or you think that your culture is worth defending, you're not just defending something psychological. It's like the culture, the functioning culture keeps the lights on. You know, so it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. It also protects you from death. And that's even more important most of the time than being protected from death anxiety. Now, there's a psychological component to it too, but you don't ever want to underestimate just the practical utility of being nested inside, you know, what Piaget would consider a relatively functional game. It's like, your world's a lot simpler. You know, you have to work to maintain it and everything, and that's kind of a drag, maybe. That's the tyrannical element of it, but, you know, the payoff's pretty big. Okay, so if you look at medieval cities, this is a well-preserved medieval city in France. There's a lot of medieval cities that still exist in Europe. And you see, this is a typical sort of human habitation. It's like, inside there's order, and outside there's chaos and barbarians, and then there's a couple of walls to keep the chaos and the barbarians out, and then inside, you know, there's a dominance hierarchy and everybody can live their relatively productive and relatively peaceful lives inside of that. It's all framing, getting rid of complexity, unnecessary complexity. Same thing with houses, they do the same thing for you. And then social institutions do the same thing too. It's like, okay, this is it Kennedy there and Obama? I think so. This is part of the transition in power from George Bush to Obama. And, you know, that's a pretty scary thing to have the leader of your dominance hierarchy replaced by another leader. And, you know, among chimpanzees, for example, that's often the occasion for a fair bit of mayhem. And it's also the case often for people that that occurs. And, we still have that in the form of political corruption and so on. But all things considered, the power transition from Obama, or from Bush to Obama, was far more peaceful than such power transitions generally are if you look across the history of mankind. And so that means you're also protected by your social institutions. They screen out a lot of potential complexity as well, as long as they're functional, and also I think as long as they follow some of the Piagetian rules. And so one of the Piagetian rules for a playable game is there's some reciprocity. You regard the system, roughly speaking, as either fair or fairer than any other system you can think up. It boils down to the same thing, because if it's not fair but you can't come up with a better fantasy, well, it's as good as it can be. So the sociological or sociopolitical structures that keep complexity away from us can only operate under a certain limited number of constraints, but still they perform their function, and very admirably. It's amazing, I think, because I see people in my clinical practice all the time, and most people that I see, and I think this is true of most people in the world, have at least one serious problem. And it might be they have an illness that's just god-awful, or if they don't have an illness, one of their immediate family has an illness that's god-awful, or they're really old and they need to be taken care of, or they're suffering from some insane economic problem, or they've just been unemployed, or whatever. There's something in their immediate circle that's really, really difficult to grapple with, and yet people still go out and maintain their place in the world, and the whole thing roughly works. And to me, that's just a continual source of amazement that people can pull that off, So anyway, so a lot of the screening that you do to get rid of that complexity is external, and part of that is a consequence of good, well-functioning sociological organization. Then the next thing that sort of screens things out for you is your body, right? Now look, you kind of naturally see things at a particular level of resolution, right? There's no obvious reason why that should be. So, you see the front of people, you can't see the back of them. You see their external covering, their skin and their clothes. You can't see inside them. When you look closely at them, you can't see their cellular structure or their molecular structure or their atomic structure. You can't really see the social situations that they're embedded in. So if I look at you, I can't see your family. I presume you have one. I can't really see the political situation that surrounds you either. I have to know that abstractly, and then the ecological level is almost completely imperceptible to me. And so part of the way that complexity is screened out is that your body just doesn't allow you to pick a lot of it up. You're just blind to it. So you see at one level of resolution, and that's the human level. You see things of approximately our size. You see things that are approximately the size that we can grip. Those are sort of the things that you're likely to think of as objects. Like clearly a mountain isn't exactly an object, so usability is part of what defines perceptibility. And so that also screens things out. And so then you're left with, well, what it is that you have to deal with once everything's been screened out. And then you might ask, well, there's still a lot of complexity left there. Like there's plenty of complexity within the average family. And there's plenty of complexity in the mating domain, to find a partner and to establish a reasonable long-term relationship and to have children and to raise them. There's plenty of complexity left. And then the question is, how did biology come to solve those problems, given that they're almost infinite in complexity? How can you do it? And the answer to that is fundamentally a Darwinian answer. You start simple, so that's back in the days of the one-celled organisms. We have no idea how those things got their start, right? I mean, the actual beginning of life is a serious mystery. And I'll tell you, it's such a serious mystery, this is completely unbelievable, but one of the people who discovered DNA, I think it was Francis Crick, in fact, I'm virtually certain it was, he actually believed that DNA came from an alien civilization. He wrote a whole book about that. It's called panspermia, and so he posited that it's possible for DNA to drift through space for millions of years and to land on planets and to start living, and that God only knows how old DNA is, because he just couldn't figure out at all how it could have possibly evolved. So scientists are a lot weirder than you think when you start to read, you know, about what the scientists who discover things really thought. They're completely, you know, out of their mind. But whatever, we'll assume that DNA got there somehow, and then evolution took over after that. And so what does evolution do? It basically says, well, here's a terribly complex problem that we've sort of partially solved. And partially solved means we've lived long enough to produce another copy of ourselves. That constitutes the solution. That's it. So we've lived long enough so that we can conceivably duplicate ourselves. How should we do that? Well, a variety of different ways. That's the answer. We should produce variants. So that might be multiple offspring, or it might also be facilitated by random mutation. Hypothetically, the mutations are random. Although there's increasing evidence, by the way, that organisms are much more complex at the genetic level than anyone ever assumed. And bacteria, for example, swap DNA back and forth with other bacteria all the time. And there are experiences that you can have that will change your genetic structure sufficiently so that you will transmit that to your children. So, you know, the idea that everything's purely Darwinian and it's only mutation that drives randomness, that's clearly likely, but not complete. These other mechanisms are clearly there. But the issue is that what you do is you start with something that kind of works, and then you produce microvariants of it, and then the world around you changes a little bit, and hopefully one of those microvariants manages to do the same thing, and then it produces a bunch of microvariants, and then they manage to do the same thing. And so what's happening is there's an arms race between the environment, which is always changing, and the organisms that are trying to keep up with it, and that arms race just goes on forever, and you know, different life forms proliferate as that occurs. It's sort of like life is always playing catch up, and you never get it right. You cannot get it right. The best you can do is get it right long enough to live long enough to reproduce. That constitutes the sum total of your knowledge. So what that means, at least in part, is that you guys are all the beneficiary, let's say, of a evolutionary process that's basically been going on since the beginning of life, and that's about 3.5 billion years ago. And so your body, your psychophysiology, has been in an arms race with the transforming environment for 3.5 billion years trying to keep up, and poof, you're the stellar consequence of 3.5 billion years of like effort and death. So, you know, you might thank the cosmos about that. You think about this, eh? Every single one of your female ancestors successfully reproduced. Like, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. You're so unlikely that you would be here that it's almost incalculable. So, good for us. Here we are, you know. How successful can you get? So, my point is that part of the way that complexity is dealt with is haphazard. It isn't ever really dealt with. That's why you die. You can only manage it to a limited degree. And for us, that's like 3 kids in 100 years, if you're lucky. And that's our knowledge after 3.5 billion years. So the complexity problem is a rough one. Okay, so that's your body. Now let's look inside your body. Now you might think that, you know, we have this sort of idea that's kind of leftover Cartesian, that there's a you and there's your body, and the you is in your brain. And so, just out of curiosity, how many of you have the subjective sense that the you is in your head? How many of you would locate you, like, for me, I can locate me somewhere, seems to be about there. I feel like that's where I am. And so, how many of people have like the center of their sense of subjectivity in their head? How many people are like that? Okay. How many people are different than that? Okay, so, oh good, okay, so where do you feel the center of your subjectivity? Where would it be?
That's hard to conceptualize, because like, I have like religious views, so I believe in the soul, and I believe that...
Oh, I was thinking more about how it feels. Fair enough, you know, that's perfectly reasonable. I'm thinking of it more as a subjective experience, though.
That's my brain.
Okay.
For me, the heart.
So you're kind of located here?
Yeah.
How many people would agree with that? Oh yeah, so quite a few of you, eh? So that's the same for you?
Here, I don't know.
More like here.
Yeah.
Oh, Any other places? Any other places you can talk about? So, yeah. Sorry. Any other places?
More outside of my body. I don't know. It's not like.
Oh, that's not good. That's not... No, I'm kidding. Okay. So we kind of got head and heart, and that's really kind of historically standard. The Greeks seem to have located themselves sort of in their heart, and there's some theory that as people became more intellectualized, that feeling sort of went up to their head, and maybe before the heart there was the stomach, And you might think that you're your stomach if you were hungry all the time, right? I mean, you're just not ever hungry, so like why the hell would you think you were your stomach? But that's another way that culture sort of keeps complexity at bay. You don't even, that's almost like a motivational state that modern people don't even have to contend with, because you're never really hungry. I mean, how many of you have gone without food for more than 24 hours? Oh, that's pretty good. How many of you involuntarily went without food for more than 24 hours? Oh yeah, well that's rough. Okay, how about a week? Nobody. How about 3 days? Okay, well, so, there's a couple of people who've gone for reasonable periods of time without eating, but fundamentally you can tell we kind of got that problem under control. So you don't have to worry too much about you being your stomach, but I'll tell you, if you were starving at some point, that's probably where you'd locate yourself. Okay, so now you're inside the body, and so let's take a look at how the body works inside. So you kind of feel that you're in your brain, most of you anyways, and you kind of think your brain is in your head, but really that's not right. I don't really understand ever why we kind of decided that our brains were in our head, because, well, look at it. There's the nervous system. It's like, it's not in your head. It's distributed through your whole body. There's a lot of it up in your head, but there's the whole spinal cord. That's an important thing. And then it has all these branching nerves that allow you to move your hands and to feel things. And it's like your nervous system is distributed all the way through your body. So it's not reasonable to think about the way that you operate as you see things with your brain and then you do things. Now, if that's sort of true, but there's important ways that it's not true at all, and it's important to know the ways that it's not true. It helps you understand phenomena that you couldn't otherwise understand. So I can give you an example. There are people who experience blindness, but it isn't because their eyes get damaged, it's because they have brain damage, and so it damages the visual cortex, and so that's the higher order part of the brain that's responsible for conscious vision. Okay, so maybe they get, I don't know, they get a tumor, or they get hit in the head, or they get shot or something, and then poof, they're blind. And so then they tell you they can't see anything, and then you say to them, okay, well, that's fine, you can't see anything, but let's play a game, okay? I'm going to hold up my left hand or my right hand, and you're going to guess about which I'm holding up. And so you do this, and they go right, and you do this, and they go left, 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 right, right. And they're right. And you tell them, you're right, and they say, well, I can't be, because I don't see anything. So that's blind sight. Okay, so here's another kind of blind sight. So you take the same person, and you set them in front of a screen, and you say, well, look at the screen, and they tell you, I told you already I can't see anything, and then you flash faces at them, and you check for changes in the conductivity of their skin, because when people react emotionally, they sweat a little more, a little less, and that changes how electricity passes through their skin. And so you show them a smiling face, and there's not much of a change, and you show them a neutral face, and there's not much of a change, and then you show them like a really aggressive or really afraid face, and poof, spikes. And you do that a number of times, and you show them, well, as soon as I show you a face of someone who's afraid or a face of someone who's angry, you react to it psychophysiologically. You think, well, how the hell can that happen if they can't see? And the answer to that is, you don't just see with your vision. You see with your body. And so one of the things that you'll find, for example, if you go through Swanson's paper, I'll read you a little bit about this later, is that most of your senses map onto multiple levels of your nervous system. So some of them map right onto your spine. And that's good, because now and then your eyes should tell your spine to do something before you think, because thinking's too slow. And so, you got to understand, like, way back when we were frogs, roughly speaking, we had eyes. We didn't have much of a brain. So, like, what the hell were the eyes doing? It's not like the frog exactly sees. And you might think, well, how could eyes inform you about the world if you don't exactly see? And then you got to kind of think about it in a Piagetian sense. It's like, here's an example. You might take an animal like a sponge, pretty simple animal, and it can open and close pores on the outside of its surface according to different changes in the ocean that surrounds it. And so its perception is sort of like, the ocean has 3 states, whatever those might be, maybe it has 10, I don't know, but for the sake of simplicity we'll say 3. The ocean manifests itself in 3 pattern states. In pattern state 1, I do this. In pattern state 2, I do this. In pattern state 3, I do this. And so it's direct pattern onto action mapping. And so animals can use their eyes just to react with. They don't have to see the thing. You know, because you think you see and then you act, but why do that? You can just react. And you know this already because, in a simple way, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll go like this, and then you'll feel the pain. And what that means is that your body has conserved the relationship between your sensory neurons and your motor neurons at a spinal level. So that your perception of the heat is this. It's not of the heat. It's just mapping a bodily pattern onto a sensory pattern. And so a lot of really primitive sensory input is exactly that. It's just the sense detects a pattern, and with no intermediary of interpretation, that pattern is translated into a behavioral output. And so there's actually generally, the simplest cells are sensory motor cells, so they do both. They map the pattern and they react, and then the sensory and the motor cells differentiate. And then neural tissue grows inside them. And so then what happens is that instead of an outside pattern being mapped immediately onto a behavioral pattern, the neural intermediary says, okay, this pattern could mean any of these 3 things. And then that neural layer grows and grows and grows until, in creatures like us, it's like a whopping layer. And so we see a pattern and we go, that could be this, 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 this. And then all of those things could be mapped onto this or this or this or this or this. So, you know, it makes us slower, but more flexible. And slow can be a problem. So like when you're walking down a pathway and a snake appears, you don't want to be thinking, you know, snake, rubber hose, stick, whatever, you know, because then you're dead because the snake bites you. What you want to do is catch the snake out of the corner of your eye and jump up into the air before you even know that you saw a snake. And you can do that because your eyes can map right onto your spine. And they don't just map right onto your spine, they map onto your nervous system at all sorts of levels. So for example, with the blind sight person who's looking at the face, so it's an angry face, the eyes are still mapping information onto the amygdala. And so the amygdala changes the psychophysiology. You know, it says prepare for threat. And so the person might feel uneasy. But it's weird, but that's a form of sight. To feel uneasy can be a form of sight. So, and that's to say even more clearly that your brain just isn't in your head. It's like, it's all the way up. It's all the way from, and this is a nice Piagetian viewpoint because, you know, in some sense what Piaget says about children is they sort of organize themselves from the spinal level upwards. You know, they learn these little subroutines. First of all, they have a few subroutines. Those are like built right into the spine. And then they start playing with those and chaining them together in flexible ways, and they keep doing that, you know, in more and more complex ways until they're capable of the abstract representation of thought. And you can see how this will work as we go through the nervous system. So your brain's in your body. In fact, there's some evidence, and there's more than one kind of nervous system too, right? There's the central nervous system that allows you to move voluntarily and that, you know, provides you with sensory feedback, some of which you're conscious of. There's also the autonomic nervous system that runs all the complex machinery that you're too stupid to attend to. You know, because your consciousness gets little jobs. It doesn't get to run your liver, for example. You imagine what your life would be like if you were in charge of your liver? It's like you'd have been dead years ago, because what do you know about livers? So you have a whole system, like the autonomic nervous system, which has more neurons than the central nervous system, that just runs all that stuff for you, which is, you know, a good thing, you know, and then you don't have to pay attention to it. So anyways, there's a lot of distribution of neural tissue throughout your body, and there's even some evidence that you have like a second brain of sorts in your solar plexus, where, you know, That's perhaps part of the reason why you really don't like to get hit there. But there's a tremendous number of serotonergic neurons, for example, in your midsection, and there's increasing evidence that those are associated with things like emotion and mood. And so the idea that the brain is here, it's like, no, not really. It's a continuum. You know, your body is a psychophysiological entity, and to separate it into body and mind is like, it's not right. The other thing that seems to be increasingly clear among, say, the robotics guys is you can't even be smart unless you have a body. And so that's why the advanced intelligence guys are building robots from the bottom up. They're doing it just like Piaget would have suggested. It's like, well, build some things that can move, and then chain those things that can move together so that they can move in more complex ways, and then chain them together so they can work in more complex ways. And once you've got this thing that can do things, then stick a brain on it. And then it'll have things it can do with its brain. And if you don't do it that way, you get something that can't function intelligently. It's close to that. So there is the brain, and the major, one way of dividing it into its major subcomponents is represented. There's a variety of ways you can do this. You can divide it into hemispheres because it's sort of split down the middle. The right hemisphere seems to be kind of specialized for the processing of unknown information, and the left seems to be more comfortable working where you know what's going to happen. And that the left is most generally the linguistic part of the brain, although not always. It's a rough, you know, what would you call it? It's a rough truth. There's lots of exceptions. The linguistic system tends to specialize in the left. And the left sort of insists that it knows what's going on. And the right is always looking out for things that don't fit and sort of convincing the left slowly and sort of under the table to change its viewpoints. And a lot of that seems to happen when you're asleep and you're dreaming. So the right, maybe what's happening when you're dreaming is that during the day your cognitive processes are pretty tight and defined, and they better be, right? Because you don't want to be dreaming your schizophrenic dreams in the daytime. That's a bad idea. So you got to stay kind of focused and narrow in a way during the day. But the problem with that narrow focus is that you're not paying attention to a lot of things. And so it kind of looks like your right hemisphere keeps track of the potentially important things that you're not keeping track of, and then at night your category system sort of broadens and loosens. You can tell that in dreams because they're so weird, and that's maybe when the right hemisphere is sort of tapping some new information into the left and playing with how it might be recategorized without completely overwhelming the left, because you don't want to, just because you learn something new doesn't mean you want to upset yourself totally, right? So it's a real complex dynamic between stability and learning, and it's conceivable that's why you have two hemispheres. So who knows? It's a good theory though, and the guy who came up with it fundamentally, his name is Goldberg, L. Goldberg. He was a student of Alexander Luria's, who was a great neuropsychologist. So, you know, it's a credible idea. So here's some rough divisions. You've got your cerebellum. That cerebellum, we don't know what the hell that thing does. If you don't have one, you get all wobbly. But there's more neurons in the cerebellum than there are in the rest of the brain. So, like, is it just making you not wobbly? It seems like a tremendous devotion of resources to something that's relatively simple. So, alcohol, when you're a new drinker, alcohol is really hard on the cerebellum, which is why you're, you know, totally useless in a motorway and you fall down and all those things happen. But so that's the cerebellum, and we don't know what it does, even though it's very complexly branched. It kind of looks like a cauliflower, and it's just packed full of neurons. And then there's the occipital lobe, and that you kind of use that to see with, more or less. And then the parietal lobe kind of helps you keep track of who you are from a bodily perspective, and sort of where your body's located in space, and sort of who you are as an embodied person. So, for example, if you lose the right parietal lobe because you have a stroke, then you lose the left side of your body, and even more weirdly, you lose the left side of everything. So all of a sudden you can't see the left side of anything. And no one can figure out what that's like, because say I'm looking at this room and I have this parietal damage. If I'm looking at the room, do I not see the left side of the room? And then if I look at you, all of a sudden I don't see your left side. Like, we can't figure that out. like the left is gone, but then the left is relative to where you happen to be looking. I think one of the ways of understanding it is sort of like, you know how you clearly can't see anything behind your head. And it's not black where you can't see, right? It's black if you close your eyes. But there's a difference between what you can't see behind your head and the black you see when you close your eyes, because the black sort of seems like nothing. But compared to what's behind your head, it's not nothing at all. So I think what happens with people who have neglect, parietal damage, is that like back part just goes like this. And so instead of, you know, you seeing this much of the world and this being just not there at all as far as vision is concerned, it goes like this. And so then you've only got like a quarter of the world that you're, and so people like that, sometimes they'll throw their own legs out of bed. So they wake up and they think, oh my God, because they can kind of detect the left, but not very well. And they're quite freaked out because, you know, like, do you really want to wake up with a leg in bed with you? No, so they grab it and throw it out, and that's not so good because they're attached to it. Or so they'll eat, and they only eat half the food on their plate. But if you turn the plate, then they'll eat half of the half that's left. So anyways, that's the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe. That enables you to hear, roughly speaking. There's a lot of memory there too. And the frontal lobe, well, first of all, the frontal lobe seems to allow you to make voluntary movements, sort of at the highest level of abstraction. And then the prefrontal cortex, which would be right at the front of the yellow there, it's sort of like the back part of the frontal lobe enables you to make voluntary movements. But the prefrontal cortex enables you to represent the potential motor movements that you might make before you implement them. And so it evolved out of the motor strip during the course of evolution. It's sort of like, well, first you learned how to act voluntarily, and then as that grew, and it's particularly big in human beings, that part was able to divorce actions from your body, represent them in an abstract space, run them as simulations, calculate the outcome, and then implement them or not. And you know, it's a hit and miss business because lots of you people undoubtedly simulate catastrophic outcomes and then go do whatever it is you were going to do anyways. Like, you know, that happens to people all the time, say when they're trying to stop drinking or to stop using cocaine or not to binge eat. Or so, you know, your prefrontal cortex can whip up these simulations, but other parts of your body can override them quite badly. So that's sort of roughly the brain, at least from, you know, looking at it from the side. And then this is it split down the middle. And you can see that it's not precisely two hemispheres all the way down. In the middle, it's one thing, and then it grows these two things like a little hat. And as far as I'm concerned, all the important parts of the brain are low down, central, old. You know, because people like to think that, well, if it evolved a long time ago, it's primitive. It's like, no. If it evolved a long time ago, it's been around a long time. It's really smart. That's why you don't run your liver. The autonomic nervous system runs it because it's been around for an awful long time and it knows exactly how to do it. And so it's really, in some sense, the new parts of the brain in many ways are the parts that are primitive. So and the old parts are extremely necessary and sophisticated. And so the areas we're going to concentrate on most particularly are, well, the cortex we've already talked about. The cortex is probably responsible, people like to think of it as responsible for consciousness, and there's something about that that's right, but it's quite clear that human beings can remain conscious even if they have a substantial amount of damage to the cerebral cortex. So consciousness is a really weird thing. We're not very good at figuring out where it's localized at all. Cerebral cortex, thalamus. The thalamus is the place where all your sensory information comes together. So, you know, when you look at the world, it's kind of like a continuum of experience despite the fact that you have these 5 different sensory inputs. And the thalamus seems to sort of unite all that, and then it sends the messages that it amalgamates up to the cortex, and the cortex sends them back, and the thalamus sends them back, and there's like this loop between the thalamus and the cortex. And maybe that's part of what consciousness is. You know, rather than being localized in an area, it could easily be a process. And you know, the fact that consciousness sort of turns on in the morning, which is a very weird thing, seems to indicate to me that it's probably something like that. It's a loop It's the looping interaction between brain areas. And you know, if something's looping like that, it gets really weird properties. So that's a positive feedback system, you know. And I don't know if you've ever hooked a video camera to a TV and then turned the video camera on the TV. You know, it starts doing extremely weird things. You can get all sorts of unbelievably complex designs and weird phenomena because the TV is recycling its own signal, you know. So there's this circuit in there that's looping. And I suspect consciousness is something like that. The hippocampus is responsible for the movement of short-term information into long-term storage. It's a very important part of the brain. We'll talk about that more next time. The amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotional responses. And the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of primordial motivational states. And so we'll stop, and we'll start with the hypothalamus on Tuesday. See you soon. So we talked a little bit about motivation last time, or quite a bit about motivation. And what I told you that I was basically teaching you a personality neuroscience approach to personality. And part of the reason that I have to go into the biology is to give you the kind of foundation that you need in order to understand, I would say, what's essentially the cutting edge in personality research. You know, I mean, I know that what we covered last lecture and what we're going to cover today are relatively complicated, but if you get them right, then you're right at the forefront of our ideas about brain function and emotion and about personality. So you get all that at the same time, and today you'll get a little bit of learning theory thrown in as well. So learning theory is basically what used to be what's alternatively described as behaviorism. And I used to teach behaviorism in this class, but I've subsumed it underneath the biology because a lot of the old behavioral presuppositions, although they were extremely useful, were not right, which is exactly what you'd expect. They were formulated in the 1950s. And it's actually the sign of the progress of a science that theories that are 60 years old are no longer right. So we'll also cover a little bit of behavioral theory today too. So, okay, so the hypothesis we've been working on so far, or we'll call it the working theory, is that motivations set goals, or more accurately, that they define a conceptual space within which you perceive the world and within which you act towards some goal, or to some endpoint. And the endpoint, in some sense, is specified by the motivational system. It's a hypothalamic system often, but not always. But not only is the goal specified, but the underlying motivational systems also tune your perception, so you're only looking at the things that you know to be relevant to the pursuit of that goal. And they also either disinhibit or activate the behavioral schemes that you would normally use to pursue the goal. And sometimes those, or let's say the motor schemes, because that would be more accurate. When you think about behavior, you tend to think about voluntary behavior, but a motivational state will disinhibit or activate, depending on the situation, autonomic responses. So for example, when you're food deprived and you start to think about food and start to organize your behavior towards food as an end and to perceive the world that way, your body also prepares for food. And so the motivational state is an all-encompassing psychophysiological phenomena. It's not something as simple as chain behavior, which was an early behavioral theory, or as simple as something that's merely setting a goal. It's much more complicated than that. It's useful to think about, as we've already talked about with regards to psychodynamic theory, it's useful to think about a motivated state as a micro-personality. I mean, it's got one aim in mind fundamentally, so it's not particularly sophisticated, but it has all the other elements of a personality. So motivation establishes the framework within which goals are pursued and the goal itself. And then, roughly speaking, emotions, or at least many of the emotions, track progress towards goals. And so they kind of tell you whether you're on the right track or not. So that's a reasonable way of distinguishing them, even though there is no single motivation system or single emotion system. Here's some basic motivations. These are the sorts of things that Freud would have associated fundamentally with the id. So, and he thought of those as primordial, and that's exactly right, because pretty much all of these motivational systems we share, certainly with other people, also with other mammals, and then of course with animals that are farther down the evolutionary chain than mammals. So some of these systems are extraordinarily old. In fact, all of them are extraordinarily old. Hunger, consequence of food deprivation, obviously. Thirst, obviously. People are very dependent on water. Pain. Pain's complicated. There's physical pain, and then there's its mental equivalents. And the mental equivalents of pain are grief, disappointment, frustration, roughly speaking. And so the way you can think about that is, you saw the picture of the nervous system that I showed you last time with the branches going up into the brain, obviously, but with all the branches, or the roots, say, going down into the body. So we discussed the central nervous system as a sort of all-encompassing system distributed throughout the body. Imagine that part of that network throughout your body is associated with pain reception, and that would be roughly equivalent to systems registering levels of input that are high enough to potentially damage them. That's where pain seems to come in. And that different pieces of that can be activated at different times. So if it's psychological pain, as I said, grief, frustration, disappointment seems to fall into that category. Loneliness is another one. Then maybe it's primarily the cortical circuitry for pain that's activated. And although people who are depressed, for example, or who are grieving, often have somatic pain as well. And depression really looks like it's a pain state. We know loneliness is because if you take like little chicks or little kittens and you make them lonesome and they'll cry, which is or peep if they're chicks, and you can stop them from doing that by using opiates. And it's not because it stops them from vocalizing, because that would be a possibility. You just get them so stoned on, morphine that they can't peep, and you think, well, they're not lonesome anymore. So the experiments have been done carefully enough to factor out the effect of the opiates on the vocalization. So, and that's also led to some suspicion that people who have had a history of extraordinarily painful personal relationships might be those who are more prone to opiate use. And so opiates, analgesics, they basically dampen out pain and frustration and disappointment and grief and loneliness. So there's an anger and aggression system. It's complicated. There's probably two of them. One is defensive aggression. That's probably more associated with neuroticism, technically. The other is probably predatory aggression. And human beings are definitely predators. We're meat eaters, and our closest relatives, chimpanzees, for example, they're pretty good hunters. They'll gather together in packs and bring down 30-pound colobus monkeys, and the meat is very popular among the chimps. And so predatory aggression seems to be a separate circuit, and as we'll discuss further along, I think the predatory aggression circuit and the maternal solicitude circuit, because there's also a care circuit, have evolved to be at opposite ends of the same distribution. I think that's the agreeableness distribution in the big five. So on one end there's maternal solicitude, and the other end there's predatory aggression. And you can imagine how those things have to inhibit one another. Because, well, with many mammals, bears for example, the males are so predatory that you have to keep them away from the cubs because they'll kill them. You human beings, I mean, there's some aggression towards children, especially if the children aren't biological relatives, but men are pretty caring for male mammals, and women are actually quite predatory for male mammals. So thermoregulation, your hypothalamus takes care of whether you're hot or cold. Panic and escape, those are circuits that also seem to be associated with pain fundamentally, although threat can maybe trigger them as well. And the panic escape system doesn't exactly seem to be the same system as the anxiety and fear system, even though they sound roughly equivalent, right? You might think of panic as just the extreme level of fear, and I think fear can trigger panic, but panic seems to be a more primordial circuit, and if you're panicking, there's an immense impetus to to escape. So that's a different circuit. Affiliation and care we covered, sexual desire. Exploration and play, both of those seem to be separate circuits. So Jack Panksepp actually, who wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, by the way. If any of you are interested in like the psychobiology of behavior and motivation, Jaak Panksepp's book is one of the best. I don't have a paper by him in our collection, but he's a very smart guy. He wrote this book called Affective Neuroscience, and it's actually, given its title and the relative complexity of its thoughts, it's actually quite readable, even though it's a text. It's a little more personal than your typical text might be. And Panksepp is also very interested in psychodynamic and personality ideas, so he's a very broad thinker. And so if you're interested in an approach to psychology that sort of crosses the threshold from personality into emotion and biology, Panksepp, as well as Gray, there's a Gray paper that you're reading, Panksepp's a very, very good source. He discovered the play circuit, for example, and he also discovered that rats laugh. So if you tickle a rat, it laughs. You can't hear it though, because it laughs ultrasonically like a bat. But if you record the rat giggling and then slow down the tape, then you can tell that the rat laughs. And rats need to play, and most mammals need to play in order to socialize them. So one of the things, you can think about this when you're parents too, and this is probably especially relevant for the men, because one of the things you might ask is, what role do men play in the socialization of children? And one thing that men really do seem to do with kids is to engage in rough and tumble play, especially once they're a little older than 2, say 2 to 5 or something. And kids love that. They absolutely love rough and tumble play. Gets them so excited that, they get out of control fundamentally. But rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization, because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression, right? Because if you're wrestling with a kid, the kid has to keep their behavioral output under a fair degree of control to keep the game going, to make it rough enough to be exciting, but not so rough that they get hurt, or that they stick their thumb in their dad's eye or something like that. And you can think of that from a Piagetian sense too, because it's a game. But imagine that if you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around other people, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know where the boundaries of your body are, and you don't know how much you can take and how much you can be stretched and how much you can be thrown around, and when something actually hurts rather than is frightening. And so all of that intense sort of play that boys in particular are likely to engage in, although girls also like it, seems to be very useful for teaching children about how to engage with the world and with other people in a physical way, and that's one of the physiological foundations for higher order socialization. So it's very useful. I mean, I've often noted that children who haven't had the opportunity to engage in physical play, they're kind of awkward. They're not seated well in their body, and it's like they're kind of vague physically. Whereas the ones who've been twisted around and bent and thrown up in the air and wrestled in general, they're a lot more conscious of their limits and their abilities in their body, and they're also much more able to invite other kids to play. You can think about this with regards to dogs. If you have a dog, the dog, you can tell when the dog wants to play, right? What does the dog do? Yeah, it jumps around, and it puts its rear end in the air often, and its head down, and it looks up, which is a little bit submissive and a little bit friendly, and it wags its tail, and it might bark, and it moves back and forth. And like little kids that want to play they don't put their tails in the air, obviously, but they engage in like play invitation behaviors like that, a little bit of teasing sometimes, and they're trying to get some play initiated. It's also practice for later dominance. When chimps play, the males in particular, as they approach adolescence, the play behavior, because they'll throw sticks at the old chimps who are laying down and sleeping, or come up and poke them, or tease them. And then as they become more and more powerful and more adolescent, say into adulthood, then that play will become full-blown dominance challenges, as you don't no doubt noticed if you were in junior high school, because that's exactly what happens to teachers, right? The little elementary school kids, they're kind of cute. When they misbehave, they're sort of playful, but by the time grade 8 or grade 9 comes around, the pushing on the teacher is a lot harder. And so you can see how play shades into dominance dispute. But it is a separate circuit. Exploration, that's a separate circuit. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is Swanson's elaboration of the fact that half of the hypothalamus is fundamentally devoted towards exploration, which is quite cool. It means exploration is a really, really, really old system. And it's sort of like, if you haven't got anything else to do, so you don't want to play, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not angry, you're not too warm or too cold, etc., etc., your default isn't sort of quiescent sleep, right? You don't just run out of batteries and lie on the floor, unless you're, of course, obviously, unless you're very tired. What'll generally happen is if the other fundamental motivational states have been satiated, then you'll engage in exploration, and different people at different rates. If you're extroverted, you'll engage in exploration in the social environment, and if you're open, then you'll engage in exploration at a more cognitive level. So that would be with regards to artistic creativity or to fiction or the expression of some sort of intellectual or philosophical pursuit. And the reason that you're wired up that way is because if you have a little extra energy, you might as well use that to map out more of the environment so that when push comes to shove somewhere down the road, you'll be in possession of more information and more flexible and more knowledgeable in your conceptual and perceptual structures, and also in your actions. So people have a pretty strong tendency to default to exploration, but there's variability in that. You can also sort of divide up these motivations as ingestive or defensive. That's not a bad way of looking at it. And then there's reproductive motivations as well. That's unlikely to be a full map. It kind of depends on where you put the emotions, because we know, for example, that there's a separate disgust circuit, and that doesn't seem to load with anxiety or with pain. It's its own biological system, and it seems to be associated with trait conscientiousness, maybe, and also with political conservatism and orderliness. So those things are all quite interesting. They all kind of clump together. But whether that's an emotion or motivation's not exactly clear, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. So there's the hypothalamus, and as you can see, it's not one thing. Of course, nothing at the macro level in the brain is one thing, obviously. It's this layered thing, just like everything else in the world, except even more so because the brain is so incredibly complicated. And you can see by looking at that, there's all those little, all the things that are colored there are basically hypothalamic modules, I guess would be a reasonable way of putting it. And you can tell they're even anatomically distinct, so obviously they're not doing exactly the same thing. So you might think of brain anatomy as sort of a fixed, what would you call, something that we've already managed quite well, and we have all the category systems down, and the structure of the brain's quite well known, and that's really not true at all. Like, the brain is truly terra incognita, and it isn't even, like, our naming rituals, let's say, or conventions are not necessarily appropriate for one-to-one mapping of, say, structure onto function. So they're sort of anatomical, they're markers for anatomical convenience in some ways. Okay, so here's a way of thinking about it. So you have your frame, which specifies your lack, say I'm hungry, and then a goal pops up, which is, well, I should have something to eat, and the hypothalamus is modulating perceptual and cognitive circuits so that you think that, and so that you start to parse up the world into a place where a hungry person like you could become satisfied, and then the behaviors kick in that are relevant to that pursuit. And so you can think of yourself as popping through these sorts of frames on a fairly cyclic basis throughout the day. You know, obviously, you get hungry, you get thirsty, you get tired, and so your consciousness is being modulated by subcortical circuitry that is basically charged with your self-preservation, and in some ways you come along for the ride. I mean, your consciousness is mostly there, in some sense, to detect deviations from not so much expectation, but from desire, right? Because you lay out one of these little maps on the world, and then you want something to happen. And what your consciousness does, more or less, is monitor And if something that you don't want to happen happens, then consciousness will take a look in some sense. Remember that hierarchy of goals that I showed you from, motor output up to high order goals? Your consciousness kind of moves up and down that thing if you've made an error, trying to figure out at which level of abstraction that error should be rectified, which is sort of what you do when you think. And so that process is going to kick in whenever you're moving towards your desired end and something that you don't want to have happen happens, right? You usually stop. That's sort of an anxiety response, the stopping. And then if nothing else happens that's too bad, well, then you'll start to explore. And animals often do that by moving around, but people will do that just as with equal facility, just by running simulations in their mind and trying to calculate what went wrong, right? Trying to think about it. That's a form of exploratory behavior as well that would be more associated with trait openness and with intelligence. So there's how Swanson divides up the hypothalamus. See the little pink things there on the left are part of the defensive circuits, and then the red things on the left are part of the reproductive circuits. And obviously the fact that those circuits exist lays onto Darwinian theory quite nicely. The defensive circuits obviously protect you from dying, and the reproductive circuits, facilitate your reproduction. It's not much of a fairly obvious conclusion. And so those are all located in this essential part of the brain, the hypothalamus. Now, this is something that's a little more complex, so I'll go through it a little bit more carefully. So if you look on the right, this is where Swanson maps perfectly onto Piaget. And I put the Swanson paper in as a optional reading, but if you're interested in the sorts of things that we're covering in this class, that's a great paper to hack your way through, even though it's very hard, because you learn a lot about the underlying biology of some of these more complex clinical and developmental theories that we've covered. So basically, what Swanson is pointing out is that at the lowest level, at the highest resolution level of your central nervous system, you have motor output circuits that are enabling you to move, and those are communicating in large part with your spine, but also with lower parts of your brainstem. So those are fundamental movements of the sorts that Piaget would call reflexive. And then the locomotor pattern generator, I think the best way to think about this from an analogical perspective, and actually Alexander Luria used this analogy. He called behavioral patterns kinetic melodies. It's a lovely phrase, because you know how obviously a song is made out of notes, and then the notes combine into phrases, and the phrases combine, say, into passages, and then, well, even more interestingly then, if it's an orchestral piece of music, multiple instruments are playing at the same time, so it sort of extends right into the social domain. But your actions are sort of like that. They're made out of micro routines, and then those are chained together, and those are chained together in higher order abstractions and so on, all the way up to the cortex. And so Swanson points out that the motor system has three sets of inputs. So the cognitive system, that's sort of way up, that's sort of level of abstraction that's way up in the brain. So the cognitive system is where, you might do a voluntary action. So you look at something, you say, well, I'm going to pick up this piece of paper. And so that's top-down cortical control. And then the state system input to the motor system, the state system is your body monitoring what's going on inside of itself. And the autonomic nervous system is part of the motor output system. And so the state monitoring system takes a careful look, and the hypothalamus does a fair bit of this, takes a careful look at what's going on inside you, and then activates different parts of your digestive and the gut system fundamentally that you have no conscious control over. And then obviously there's sensory system inputs too. So those are the three main inputs into the motor system, and that acts on the environment. And then the motor system has this hierarchical nature that's built from the spine upwards. And so you can think of like the brain as a collection of ever expanding control systems that allow you to learn and undertake ever more complex motor schemes of action. You know, and one of the things that people think about human beings is that we're very good at thinking, right? But we're not just good at thinking. Like we're crazily adaptable in terms of our motor output. I mean, if you watch the Olympics, you know, and you see human beings can do things that no other animal could even think of doing. I mean, we're completely crazy when it comes to the sorts of things we can do with our body. Like, we're good on ice, we're good in the water, we can ski, people are really good at jumping, they can climb across buildings. Like, people who train themselves can climb like mad. I mean, human beings are unbelievably variable in terms of their motor output. So that's another part of our intelligence that's not just abstract. And so, in part, that's because we have this very well-developed cortical area that enables us to chain ever more complex patterns of behavior together, and also to develop patterns of behavior that are sort of outside instinctual specification. So you imagine with an animal that has a less complex brain, a lot of its behavior is going to be limited to those quasi-instinctual patterns of behavior that are devoted directly towards the solution of basic biological problems. But, you know, we can kind of solve those without too much effort, and then we have all this spare motor capacity left over, and people do the weirdest things with it. You know, and really remarkable, absolutely remarkable things. So that's pretty cool. We're pretty cool that way. We don't get enough credit for it, I don't think, because human beings, if you think about a human being as an animal, which, you know, people are kind of loath to do, we are definitely the most interesting animal. I mean, if you saw like a pygmy hippopotamus skateboarding, you'd think that was pretty remarkable, you know, but people, they do those sorts of things all the time, and, you know, we just take it as a matter of course. The lowest somatomotor neuron pools, the lowest level of the locomotor system, it's locomotion and action, is formed by a subset of motoneuron tools. That's wrong. Motoneurons in the spinal cord ventral horn that innervates the limb muscles responsible for locomotor behavior. I dictated this with Dragon Dictate, and now and then it does weird things, eh? So tools, God only knows where that came from. So, a set of motor neurons in the spinal cord ventral horn, so it's way down in the spine, that innervate the limb muscles responsible for locomotor behavior. When you start to think about the brain as something that moves your body, it's a lot easier to conceptualize the brain as something that's distributed through the body, you know, and your spine is actually quite smart. So even though in some sense you don't think with it, it's capable of very complex sensory detection and also motor mapping, and so mostly relatively automated and relatively reflexive. One level up, the existence of a spinal locomotor pattern generator. So this shows that the spine isn't responsible just for the most basic of motor outputs or sensory inputs. It can actually generate patterns, is demonstrated by the fact that whereas a spinal animal displays no spontaneous locomotor activity. So if you sever an animal, its nervous system, so it only has a spine, it'll just lay there. You know, you'd think it's paralyzed, that's what you would think. But coordinated limb movements characteristic of locomotion may be elicited when the limbs of such an animal are placed on a moving treadmill, thus providing somatic sensory input to the pattern generator. And so they've done this with people who are paraplegic. If you take someone who's paraplegic, and so they can't obviously walk, and you hoist them up, and you put them on a treadmill, and you lean them forward, their legs will walk. And that's spinal controlled. So that's what you're doing with your spine, you know, because you're not thinking when you walk, or you're not thinking about walking unless, you know, unless you're one of those people who can't chew gum and walk at the same time. So anyway, so it just shows you how complex you are even at the, you know, the sort of the base levels of your intelligence hierarchy. Level up, locomotor pattern controller. So it's controlling the locomotor pattern generator. In contrast, undisturbed chronic hypothalamic animals. Okay, so now one of the ways people figured out how the brain works was by sectioning animals' nervous systems when they're alive at different levels of complexity. So a spinal animal is one that's basically paralyzed. Its brain is separated from its spinal cord. But then you can separate the hypothalamus with the intact spinal cord, so it's one unit, from the cortex, and even from the memory systems, and even from most of the emotion systems. And so the animal, in some sense, hardly has a brain at all. You know, I mean, the hypothalamus, as you saw, it's a little tiny thing, and everything that's on top of that can be separated from it, and the animal can still act spontaneously. So here's an example. If this has been done with cats, and if you have a female cat, and it's in a cage, and it's only a hypothalamic animal, it can basically manage. Like, it can't learn new things very well, and it can't remember anything. Like, it doesn't have episodic memory. And so, but it can maintain its temperature, it can eat, it can engage in sexual activity, it's got defensive aggression. Like, most of the animal, in some sense, is still there from an input-output perspective. It's also hyper-exploratory, which is quite interesting, eh? Because you wouldn't think, well, an animal with no brain is the most exploratory kind of animal. Well, it happens to be the case as long as it has a hypothalamus. So that shows you, A, how old exploration is, but it also kind of gives you some clue about what the rest of the brain is doing. I mean, you explored new things, we'll say. So what that means is you have to be able to tell the difference between what's new and what isn't. And so what you need to tell the difference between what's new and what isn't is memory. And so a lot of what the higher order parts of the brain are doing is basically keeping track of where you've been. And so if you've been somewhere before, then the exploratory circuit is basically shut off as long as everything that you're doing there is working. And you need the whole brain basically to shut off the hypothalamus in some sense. That's how the thing works. It's like you're kind of a default on system. You know, your motor systems are ready to go, and you're alive and you're ready to go like a wild animal, but the cortex dampens that down, and it does that by only allowing the activities that are relevant to that area, and that might be none of them, to function at any one time. So you take off the cortex, well, the animal can still do a lot of things, but you know, its ability to match its behavior to novel situations and to learn new behaviors is very, very limited. So it becomes hyper-exploratory, but it can't remember anything, and it becomes very limited in the flexibility of its behavior. And so as you move farther up the hierarchy of complexity, then you're able to do more and more novel and more complex and more situation-specific things. So in the sense of providing a certain level of endogenous activity, which means self-generated activity, so the hypothalamic animal will move by itself without being stimulated, the hypothalamic locomotor region can be thought of as a locomotor pattern controller, which generates spontaneous inputs ultimately to the spinal locomotor pattern generator. So there's hierarchy. I already talked about behavioral state inputs. There's another picture of the nervous system just to remind you of how it looks, how it's distributed through the body. Oh, this is very interesting too. I didn't learn this till I read this paper by Swanson. I thought, that's so dumb. How could I have not learned that like 30 years ago? Swanson said that, let's go back one, did I? Yeah. Raymond Cahill was like the world's greatest neuroanatomist. He was the guy who really established the field. So did a tremendous amount of investigation into the fine structure of the brain. Like 110 years ago, a long time ago. And he pointed out that sensory systems have a dual projection within the central nervous system. I told you guys about blind sight already, you know, and the fact that your eyes map onto different levels of the hierarchy, say, of sensory input and motor control. Cahill basically outlined the circuitry for that. One branch goes directly to the motor system, so that's for eye to output mapping, so that's fast because there's not a lot of thinking in between. And you might think that's bad because you want to think, but it's good because sometimes you know what to do and you don't want to think, you just want to execute it as fast as you possibly can. So these lower order, simpler inputs are good for that sort of thing. One goes directly to the motor system and the other goes more or less directly to the cerebral cortex, where sensations and perceptions are elaborated and voluntary motor impulses are generated. So this sort of explains, for a long time, experimental psychology was dominated by behaviorists who thought of the animal as a stimulus response machine. And never paid much attention to the function of things like thought or emotion or complex internal states. And you know, the behaviorists got an awful long way with their idea of the animal as a sort of simple stimulus response machine, and that's partly because of this hierarchy that we're describing, you know, because you can treat an animal as if it's a pretty simple machine because it has all that simple machinery in it. It's just that on top of that simple machinery there's a lot more complex machinery. And so, but the simple machinery does a lot more than people generally think and can do more than people think. And so the fact that there are these at least 2 projections, they branch more than that, gives you right away a sense of why the behaviors could have been right and the cognitive psychologists could have been right and even the psychodynamic thinkers can be right because they're analyzing the system at different levels of hierarchical complexity and extracting out slightly different, what would you call, observations. And some of these things are, even the simpler systems can have quite complex outputs. So one of the things that the simpler sensory motor system does is detect snakes, because primates don't like snakes. In fact, there's a woman named Lynn Isbell wrote a nice book on primate vision and snakes, and she was very curious about why human beings could see so well. And she also noticed that we're very good at detecting the sort of camouflage patterns that snakes use, especially in the lower half of our visual field. And she did this cross-cultural survey around the world and found out that where there's more predatory snakes, the primates have better vision. So we sort of co-evolved with snakes. And snakes gave us vision, just like it says in Genesis, which is pretty damn funny as far as I'm concerned. And it was snakes in trees even, so. And fruit, of course, gave us color vision. So the whole Genesis story nailed it pretty well. But you know, snakes have been around long enough and have been our enemy, or say predatory reptiles, you know, if you don't really want to go with the whole snake thing, that we've evolved, we've co-evolved with them. It's like 60 million years. It's a very, very long period of time. So Darwin used to amuse himself in a Darwinian way. He'd go to there was a zoo or a place that shows reptiles. I don't remember what they're called, but they had one glass cage where there was some kind of poisonous snake. I think it was a cobra, and Darwin would put his face right up against the glass and the cobra would go whack, and he'd jump back. And he did that many times because he was curious about whether or not he could actually bring the snake avoidance reflex under conscious control, and he couldn't. Every time the snake jumped, he'd jump backwards. He couldn't control it. And so that's because all the primates that could control it, when there were snakes biting them, are dead. So Darwin was the beneficiary of the Darwinian process in that sense. So the point is, your body's conserved all these low-level, fast operating circuits. And so you're a simple machine and a sort of complex machine and an extremely complex machine, and then something that's so complex that you can't even think about it as a machine. And you're all those things at the same time. And there's Swanson's take on how the motor system and the hypothalamus are integrated. So it's quite nice. He shows that the hypothalamic controller, so that's one of the circuits that we've been talking about that are responsible for a basic motivated state, gets sensory input, behavioral state input, that's about the body, and input from the cerebral hemispheres. Hypothetically, that's thought or voluntary action, plan, something like that. And then it has output to the motor pattern initiator, the generators, and the motor neuron pools, and then you act. Lovely. It's a very beautiful, beautiful model. And so you can see that it maps very nicely onto that with the sort of higher order levels of the hierarchy of sensory motor framing associated with cognitive abstractions, and the lowest levels associated with the sorts of things that you do with your spine. And I flipped this upside down here because I've been very interested in how people get traumatized, and it's easier to think of trauma when you flip the thing, because once you develop the higher order abstractions cortically, you know, you say, well, I'm a good person, let's say, then that's sort of the fact that you're a good person, or what constitutes good, starts to become a box, the box, within which all the things that are associated with it are put. It's one of the dangers of abstraction, right, and categorization, because if you couldn't think of yourself as a good or bad person, let's say you didn't have that capacity for that level of abstraction, which is like a binary abstraction, right? Good is, you know, 1 and bad is 0. So it's a really simple abstraction. And so if you do something that a good person wouldn't do, well, clearly you don't fit into the 1 category because a good person wouldn't do that, so maybe you fit into the 0 category. And that capacity for abstraction is also precisely the sort of thing that allows human beings to undermine themselves with thought. Because once you have that capacity for abstraction, you can make these ridiculous overgeneralizations. In fact, they're really simple. I'm not a good person, I'm a horrible person. It's like that's how someone who's really depressed thinks whenever anything goes wrong. And so it's the danger, the powerful danger of abstraction is that you can make a terrible mistake in overgeneralization. This is partly because, well, let's say, I don't know, you're out with your girlfriend and you flirt with someone else. So what does that say about your character? Well, she might think that puts you in the 0 category, like now, right? You're not a good person. It's like, well, it's complicated. Is that true? Do you belong in that 0 category? She might treat you like that for a week or 2. I mean, should you be taking yourself apart completely because you've made that error? Or should you seek farther down the chain of abstractions for a more specific mistake? Or should she help you do that? It's like, well, you're not a complete 0, you're more like a, 0.1. She could help you figure out exactly where in your personality hierarchy you have this fault, assuming that it's a fault. Maybe it's an indication that the relationship is over. Who knows? So, anyways, I wanted to show you that because then you can develop a sense of how this hierarchical system can also lead to cataclysmic overgeneralization. And that's associated with lots of different mental illnesses, especially depression. Because depressed people generally go from a small mistake, well, a mistake, hard to parameterize, right to the highest level of abstraction. Say, well, I've made error A, therefore I'm useless, or therefore I'm bad. It's not good. It's too undifferentiated. I put that in there to remind you that all these little things are informed by the underlying hypothalamic circuits. So, that whole hierarchy has to be, imagine how it's conditioned, that whole hierarchy of motor output. Part of it is conditioned by, and then this is sort of like an output or an input system that Swanson didn't talk about. It's sort of sensory. That whole sensory motor hierarchy, sensory motor perception action hierarchy, we'll say, has to be constructed so that your basic motivational states stay satiated, right? Because otherwise you get thirsty enough and you die, or you get hungry enough and you die. It's like you have to organize your behavior so that those basic motivations stay fulfilled. So each of the little ovals that make up that hierarchy have to be organized and laid out with that set of limitations in mind. But then, of course, there's a higher order limitation, which is more the one that Piaget talked about, which is that not only do you have to organize your internal hierarchies to take care of all of your basic motivations, but you have to do that while everyone else is doing the same thing. And so in some sense, the hypothalamic system that's generating the impetus for these layers and layers of motor output also has to do so in a social context. Because otherwise, you fight to the death over a stick of bread, which seems like a very counterproductive thing to do. So I'm trying to point out to you how many parameters that hierarchical organization has to meet simultaneously. Also, that one of the implications of that is that it's not an arbitrary system. This is one of the problems I have with the radical moral relativist stance. It's like, wait a minute. For you to set up your perceptual and behavioral system, it has to solve a whole bunch of problems, and they're really complex problems, and they're kind of arbitrary in some sense. Like, you get hungry and you need to eat. It's arbitrary. So what that means is you can't fill that hierarchy with just any old thing. Not only does it have to work to keep all the complex parts of you functioning here and now, but it has to keep them functioning here and now in a way that doesn't disturb them functioning tomorrow or the next day or the next week or the next month. So that's integration across time spans. That's a killer, right? Because you can't just go out tonight and drink 40 ounces of vodka and then, write the test on Thursday. So there's probably not. So some of you might try. So, but then you also have to organize your behavior in the here and now, with your behavior spread across time frames, in the presence of other people who are also organizing their behavior across time frames. It's like once you put that many parameters on the organization of a personality, you can see right away that it can hardly be arbitrary. You know, it's tightly constrained. Okay, so here's some basic emotions. We talked about basic motivations. And so what we're going to do in a simple way is we're going to divide them into two: positive emotions and negative emotions. Okay, and that basically gives you extroversion and neuroticism. So positive emotions, they kind of fall into two classes. The one class is the positive emotion you feel when you run a motivational frame to its limit. So you're hungry, you go have a peanut butter sandwich, and then you're no longer hungry. Okay, so what's the state? How do you define the state after you've eaten your peanut butter sandwich and you're no longer hungry? Well, you know, you're not jumping up and down and cheering like someone who just made a touchdown, right? So it's not that kind of enthusiastic positive emotion that you see when people are celebrating. You know, it's more like satisfaction. And that's actually technically what it's known as, satiation. And so when a motivational routine runs successfully, what happens is it eliminates the necessity for it to exist temporarily. So basically what happens is you run a framework to its logical conclusion, poof, it disappears, because it's done. And you know, you might be satisfied about that, but the next thing that happens is another motivational framework pops up and you're in the same game. It's Sisyphus, fundamentally. So anyways, it's satiation that is, the term satiation is technically used to describe the state of being that's characteristic of the successful execution of a motivated frame. It's also known as consummatory reward. Consummation, consume. And that's associated with unconditioned, that's an unconditioned response. Which means you don't have to learn it. So it's an unconditioned positive response. So, and that means that satiating stimuli, when delivered to a creature in the proper motivational frame, have the properties of unconditioned rewards. So you get three things there. You know, the satiation brings the motivated frame to an end. The satiation is also known as consummatory reward. Consummatory reward is very similar to what the behaviors described as unconditioned reward, unlearned. So you can stack each of those things to know on top of each other, and then you've got them. The other kind of positive emotion is the positive emotion that you feel when it looks like you might get a consummatory reward. Right. Hope, curiosity, anticipation, excitement, enthusiasm. All of the positive emotions that we think of as really like happy. Happy usually has to do with evidence that your pursuit of a valued consummatory reward is going well. Okay, now that's incentive reward, and the reason it's called incentive reward is because you're incentivized to move forward to the reward. And the moving forward, the impulse to move forward towards a desired goal, that's what your positive emotion systems, the dopaminergic systems that are nestled, have their roots in the hypothalamus, that's what they motivate you to do. That's what positive emotion is, fundamentally. Positive emotion is, there's something good, I'm going to go get it. It's the I'm going to go get it part that's associated with excitement and positive emotion. It's what you feel, maybe you're an extrovert, you want to go to a party. And so you're probably more excited about going to the party than you will be when you get there, you know, because it's the apprehension of the reward that's with human beings, because we're such weird creatures. So often the apprehension of the consummatory reward is a more powerful emotion than the emotion that's actually felt as a consequence of gaining the reward itself. And that's partly, and this is where it gets a little more complicated, that's partly because we're so bloody exploratory. You know, so there's things that you can learn about that are associated with the consummatory reward. Those are conditioned rewards. So an incentive reward and a conditioned reward are in the same category, although not all incentive rewards are learned. This is where the behaviors went wrong, because the behaviors thought there are consummatory rewards, those are unconditioned rewards. To get a conditioned, if you condition a stimulus to an unconditioned reward, you get a conditioned stimulus with a conditioned reward as a response. But the problem with that line of thinking is that there's actually incentive reward circuitry. It's not just secondary learning. It's like incentive rewards have been around so long, so those are things that indicate that a consumatory reward is coming. They've been around so long that your brain has developed its own circuit for that, and that's the one that produces positive emotion. And so that's also produced, by the way, when you're taking a drug of some sort that you really like, that's because it's activating this dopaminergic incentive reward system. If you take a drug that activates consumatory reward, you just like lay in front of the fire like a sleeping dog. You know, it's not exciting. It's cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol for lots of people nail the incentive reward system, and that's the dopaminergic exploratory system that emerges out of the hypothalamus. And it's also the thing that learns what to associate with consumatory rewards. So I know that's a lot to take in, but, well, it doesn't matter. That's how it is. So the approach systems respond to cues of consumatory reward, and they also respond to a large set of biologically prepared stimuli, smells, for example. So now you should approach good things, but if a bad thing happens, what should you do? Well, one thing you should do is stop. Another thing you should do is get the hell out of there. So there's a constellation of negative emotions that are associated with defense and avoidance, and we kind of ran through those already. Pain, grief, frustration, disappointment, and then fear, which is sort of what you learn. You learn that things to be feared signal primary pain stimulus. You know, so a child's going to be afraid of a needle, especially if a child's got a needle before. Most children are smart enough to figure out they should be afraid of the needle even when they haven't had it. But the thing is that if you come into contact with something that's already caused you pain, and now there's something that only signals that that's likely to happen, that's when you experience fear. Okay, and fear is its own circuit, again, which is where the behaviors in some sense went a little bit wrong too. Because they thought of unconditioned punishment, which produces pain, as the primary motivational system. So it would be unconditioned punishment, unconditioned reward. Then there were things you learned about those that produced conditioned punishment and conditioned reward. Okay, but all of those have circuits, independent circuits. So the defense and avoidance negative emotions seem to be roughly pain, anxiety, and fear, but then there's disgust. And people have been looking at disgust a lot lately, and it doesn't load on neuroticism. It doesn't seem to load on neuroticism, so it's its own circuit. So, okay, so here's one other complexity that you need to grapple with, which is there are things that hurt that cause you pain. There are things that are satiating and that are consumatory reward. Then there are things that signal each of those. But there's one class of stimuli, so to speak, or things that you're going to encounter that are paradoxical. And that's the class of things that you don't understand. That's novelty. And novelty, it's novelty itself that's sort of associated with what the phenomenologists are primarily concerned about. The idea of the revelation of meaning. Because the revelation of meaning is mostly associated with you encountering something that you haven't already understood, right? You explore that, new information comes out of it, a new you comes out of it. Okay, so you're going from point A to point B. What might happen? Well, things might happen that appear to demonstrate that you're on the right track. So that makes you happy. That's the yellow box, positive emotion. You know, your pathway is being facilitated, so that's why tools are sort of in that category. Or you can be moving towards point B and something gets in your way, and that might be something that hurts you. And that hurt would be pain or disappointment or frustration or grief, or something that signals that you might get hurt, which is threat, and that produces fear. And so the positive emotion is moving you towards the desired goal, and the negative emotion is protecting you. And so if a negative thing happens, you'll stop and then you'll reconfigure the behavior that you're using or the framework in order to get around the obstacle and to continue. Or if it's a bad enough obstacle, you might say, well, I'm too tired to eat and I'm too hungry to sleep. That happens to people, right? It's a conflict of motivations. And so if you get up and you go into the cupboard and you find out there's nothing to eat, you might say, oh, to hell with it, then I'll just go to sleep. You know, so sometimes the way you solve a problem is by flipping the problem. It's like, we're not going to solve that problem right now, we'll turn to another problem. And that's an exploratory move. Sometimes you operate within the frame, you know. You go to the cupboard is bare, but you're hungry, so you walk down to the corner store and you get something to eat. And so that way you've sort of stayed within the frame and altered, you know, you've altered your behavior you've thought up another path and altered your behavior so that that motivated state can run to completion. Here's another way of looking at it. You can be moving from point A to B, and what you predict or want is happening. That's a good thing. That keeps your mood straight and you happy, and that makes you hope. That's a promise. With the promise is you're going to get what you want, and that fills you with hope. That's positive emotion. Or you can have an unpredicted outcome when you're, you know, I don't know, you're supposed to be going out with your friend. You go to the door, you knock, and there's nobody there. So it's like, what's up with that? And so it's, in a sense, when that happens, there's like a hole in your framework, you know, because your framework was predicated on the presence of your friend, right? It was a presupposition. And so now and then you'll run out of behavioral routine, and one of your presuppositions is wrong. It's sort of like there's a hole in your theory, and the hole, you sort of drop into it. And when you drop into that hole, you get anxious because you don't know exactly what this unexpected thing means. And behind that, you get exploratory. So with most people, they're going to get afraid first. They're going to have negative emotion first when their little plan is blown. And then if nothing additionally awful happens, and if they don't drive themselves crazy with some hypothesis about he doesn't like me anymore, and so no one likes me anymore, so I'm a terrible person, you know, then once they calm down a little bit, the exploration circuit will come up, and maybe they'll walk somewhere else, go to a bar, or maybe they'll stand there and think, well, you know, this didn't work out, so what else could I do? An emotionally stable person, say a non-neurotic person, they'll flip to that really fast, especially if they're extroverted and open. Whereas someone who's heavy in negative emotion, you know, the fact that their friend wasn't there when they told them they would be, that might just produce a hole that they fall into, and it's, you know, so deep and painful they just go home and cry. So the neuroticism and the extroversion are, in some sense, they vary with the degree to which the negative emotion system is strong or the positive emotion system is strong, and they're two different systems. And so you can think of them, in some sense, you can think of them as units of positive emotion per unit of promise. It's a weird thing to try to quantify. Or units of negative emotion per unit of threat. So, you know, if there's a rumor going around that you're going to lose your job. Well, how much should you worry about that? Well, God, you don't know. So how do you decide? Well, you don't. Your wiring decides. So if you're high in negative emotion, you're going to get all anxious and freak out about it, which might be the right thing to do. Maybe you will lose your job. And if you're emotionally stable, you're going to think, I probably won't lose my job, but even if I do, I'm not going to worry about it. It's innate, or a lot of it's innate. So, okay, so to recapitulate, learning theory, behaviorism. There are unconditioned rewards. Those are rewards you don't have to learn. Those are the things that bring a motivated state to its closure, roughly speaking. And that makes you satisfied, satiation. That, by the way, is associated with serotonin. Serotonin is a satiating neurochemical. So if your levels of serotonin are high, you're kind of satisfied, which means you don't experience a lot of positive emotion or a lot of negative emotion. You're just kind of satisfied. It's a high dominance thing. It's like all of the consummatory rewards are there when you need them. You don't have to worry, and you don't have to get too excited. Conditioned rewards or incentive rewards indicate progress towards a consummatory reward. They can be learned or conditioned, but they can also be innate, and they're associated with dopaminergic activation, and that's the exploration circuit that comes out of the hypothalamus. Half the hypothalamus does goal specification, and the other half does exploration. And so, again, if you're pursuing something that's an identifiable goal and you fail, well, then you're going to back off. That's negative emotion. Then you're going to start to explore, and that's that dopaminergic circuit. What's associated with dopaminergic activation? Exploration, extroversion, happiness, play, enthusiasm, assertiveness, and the positive element of novelty. Okay, so that makes sense. Anybody have any questions? I know that's a lot of information, but I kind of designed this part of the course so that at this point the levels of analysis would stack up so that you could understand them simultaneously. So, the hypothalamus sets up your frames of motivation. Running one of those to its positive conclusion, that's satisfying. That's innate. It's consummatory reward. You'll work for that. Anything that indicates that that might happen, that's incentive reward. You can learn that, but some of it's also innate, which is where the behaviorists didn't know that because they thought of all the secondary stuff, the conditioned stuff, as learned. It's not all learned. Some of it's already prepared. You see a snake, that's a threat. You don't have to learn that. So fire is sort of like that as well. Blood is like that. Teeth are like that. Staring eyes are like that. Predatory postures are like that. Loud vocalizations, especially if they're like low in frequency. They indicate a large animal. All those things are things you don't have to learn to be afraid of because they've been so consistently dangerous in the past that you've built up a circuit that responds automatically to them. Question?
The extroversion and neuroticism, like, it seems like they're, well, at least in the example that you gave, that they're kind of mutually exclusive, or that as, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's complicated, you know, because they do play a bit of an inhibitory role, but they're separate circuits. You know, so you can be very extroverted and very high in negative emotion. So, and you can be very emotionally stable and very low in extroversion too. So, but they are definitely separate things. Now it's hard, you know, you can flip from laughing to crying very rapidly. You know, so people are very much capable of experiencing mixed states of positive and negative emotion. Plus, there are forms of manic depressive disorder where people are manic and depressed at the same time, which I wouldn't recommend. The people I know that have had that, they seem to think that is certainly not fun. So, agitation. Okay. Tremendous agitation. Okay. So you're probably sort of like that when you're deeply confused and you're really bothered by it. Because then the threat circuits are going, but you're also sort of wandering around going, oh, what am I going to do? That's all like approach behavior. Approach motivation isn't always positive, eh? I mean, most of the time it is, but intensity matters. And controllability matters too. So, okay. Unconditioned punishments. Fundamentally, they produce pain. They also tend to, if you run a behavioral routine or a motivated framework that results in punishment, you're less likely to run it again in the future. That's learning. If you run a motivated frame and it works, you're more likely to run it in the future. That's learning too. So, unconditioned punishments decrease the probability that you're going to run a given motivational frame because it failed, right? You ran it and you got hurt. It's like, don't do that again. That's part of the purpose of memory. And the pain-like emotions, just to say it again, are pain, frustration, disappointment, grief. Sadness is in there as well. So those are pain-like states of emotion. Conditioned punishments. Those are things that indicate that a punishment is likely. Some of them you can learn, some of them you don't have to, because they're already built into you. The negative emotions are dampened by serotonin. That's the fundamental brain system, fundamentally. The serotonergic system is like a conductor of the orchestra. It keeps everything in balance. And GABA. GABA is an anxiolytic. It makes people less anxious. It's endogenous. Your brain produces it. If you take Valium or barbiturates, they act on the GABA system, and so does alcohol. That's part of the reason why people like alcohol, because it dampens anxiety. Now, for some people, alcohol also produces dopaminergic activation. So they really like alcohol because it calms them down, like they're not anxious anymore, and it also it produces incentive reward activation like cocaine. So for some people, alcohol is an absolutely deadly drug. You can probably find out if you're susceptible to alcoholism quite straightforwardly. If you want to find out, sit in a bar, take your pulse, down 5 shots, 4 shots if you're little. You got to get your blood alcohol level above legal intoxication, or you won't be able to tell. And then take your pulse again 10 minutes later. If your pulse has gone up 8 beats or more, watch it, because you're probably producing an opiate response to alcohol. Secondary consequence of the opiate response is a dopaminergic response. Reasonable probability that you'll like alcohol enough to find it difficult to stop drinking once you start. Some of you are probably like that, right? You have a few drinks, it's like, yeehaw! That's how we do it in Alberta anyways. So, so part of that's cueing the incentive reward system, and because it's an approach system and it's being cued by the alcohol, you just continue to hit it. And the dopamine kicks only occur as your blood alcohol level is rising. So you have to keep nailing yourself with alcohol, because otherwise your blood alcohol level won't keep rising and you won't get that nice enthusiasm and assertiveness that goes along with the positive element of alcohol. Neuroticism, so this is the neuroticism dimension. There's a gender difference in neuroticism. Women are about half a standard deviation higher negative emotion than men. It seems like a cross-cultural universal. The difference is more enhanced in egalitarian states like Scandinavia, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd presume, right? If you were, say, a radical, I can't remember the name. If you're someone who believes that everything occurs as a consequence of socialization, as you equalize a society, the gender differences in personality become larger rather than smaller. So, which is, you know, not what anybody expected, but that's what happened. So, boys and girls seem to have about the same level of negative emotion, but as soon as puberty hits, women become higher negative emotion than men. On average, there's still a lot of overlap between the genders, and it never goes away again across the life course once it kicks in puberty. And the reasons for that: women are smaller, their upper bodies are weaker, so they're more physical, they're at a physical disadvantage if they're in a dominance dispute. They're sexually vulnerable, plus they have to take care of infants. So I think those four things are probably enough to tilt the nervous system of women more towards negative emotion. I've often thought maybe that women's emotional systems, the negative ones in particular, are actually not tuned to the woman. I think they're tuned to the woman-infant combination. So, you know, if you think about it for a bit, it almost has to be that way, because an infant has to be carried around for like a year and a half. And so, at that point, when you have an infant, and maybe you're going to have 10, you know, you guys won't, but in the evolutionary past that would have been the case. You'd have an infant for much of your life, and then you'd be a grandmother and have an infant. It's like, why wouldn't your nervous system be tuned at puberty for the two of you instead of one of you? So how could it be any other way? Anyways. So you've got your hypothalamus, and then on top of that you've got some circuits that deal with memory and emotion. So I'm going to run you through the hippocampus and the amygdala relatively quickly. So this is a theory that was basically put together by Sokolov, who was a Russian neuropsychologist back in 1962, but it's a variant of a theory that Norbert Wiener developed back in the 40s. So here's the idea. You wander through the world, and if you're in a place that you know, your memory systems, the hippocampus looks inside your memory systems to see what it is that you want to have happen based on your understanding of the world. Okay? So, you're in a motivated state, but you have certain expectations that make sense within that state. So the hippocampus is watching what you think is going to happen. But remember, that's motivated, it's not just expectation. And then the hippocampus is also looking at the world. Now, it's looking at an interpretation of the world, because you can't help but interpret the world. But fundamentally, the hippocampus is looking inside you and outside you. And then it's seeing if what's happening inside and what's happening outside are the same, which means you know what you're doing and you know where you are. And if they're the same, so if it detects a match, then the hippocampus inhibits the amygdala and the hypothalamus, roughly speaking. Now what it actually seems to do, there's a little circuit in your brainstem called the reticular activating circuit. And it's the thing that turns your brain on at night if you're sleeping and you hear a noise that you shouldn't hear. It's like, bang, you're awake. It's the reticular activating system way down in your brainstem, puts your cortex into a high arousal state, and poof, you're conscious. Now, the hippocampus tells the reticular activating system to basically remain calm, as long as what you're expecting and desiring and what's happening are the same thing. So it's sort of like it's saying, I know you could jump up and freak out and run about, but you don't have to right now because everything's going according to plan. But as soon as there's a deviation, that's anomaly, say, then the hippocampus says, whoa, something's wrong here. And it disinhibits the reticular activating system. That turns on your emotions, especially your negative emotion. But it primes your positive emotion, and it primes some of the hypothalamic circuits too, or disinhibits them, because one way of solving the fact that something isn't going well is to switch to something else. So it's sort of like, there's a bunch of circuits on underneath you, but they're being held back, like horses in a racehorse. And then something that you don't expect happens, and the gates come up a little bit, because then you're prepared. Now, a lot of that's negative emotion. Oh, you don't know where you are. But a lot of the rest of it is, be prepared to do whatever the hell you might need to do next. And so anomaly, the hippocampus detects anomaly, that's something unexpected, and then it disinhibits your lower circuitry, and it gets you ready to go. Now, the problem is, how worried should you be when something that you don't expect happens? And the answer to that is, you don't know. That's a big problem with life, because now, something went wrong. Here's the possibilities. You're not looking at the world right. So it's actually a perceptual problem, right? Like Gray, for example, believes that you just see the world, just like it is, because he's sort of a behaviorist. It's full of stimuli, you don't have to interpret them. That's wrong, you have to interpret them. So if something goes wrong, it might be that you're looking at things wrong. Your perceptual systems are out. It's unlikely, but sometimes that's the case. But forget that. Let's say that you're looking at the world correctly, and your inferences about what went wrong. What went wrong isn't a consequence of you misperceiving. It's a consequence of some stupid problem with your stupid plan. The problem is you don't know where the error is located. And that's why I think there's temperament. Sometimes if something unexpected happens, you should really freak out. Other times you should ignore it. But you can't tell which of those is true right away. So what happens is there's a distribution. When a little thing happens, some people really get upset about it, and other people hardly care at all. And sometimes the people who get really upset about it are right, and sometimes the people who don't care at all are right. And that's why there's variability in neuroticism. Okay, now, what you do when you're exploring is you start to decompose your plan, right? If you can manage it, if you're not so gripped by anxiety that you're paralyzed, then you go into your plan and you think, well, am I a complete loser, or is it some micro thing that's gone wrong? And then you can start to decompose it and reconstruct your plan. Okay, so yeah, the other thing that this little diagram helps you understand, it's like, look, what happens is when you're laying out a plan, a motivated plan, and a hole appears in it, you have to figure out why you fell in the hole. And then what you have to do is you have to take that motivated plan that's kind of running on automatic, and you have to remember what it's made out of. And so what opens up underneath you when you've made a mistake is the complexity of the plan. And then also, potentially, the complexity of the world on the off chance that you misperceived it, right? Someone might say, you're not understanding me properly. Maybe there's something wrong with you that's interfering with the perception. And then you have to do this massive search to try to figure out where the error lies. Now, part of the reason I believe that people stick to their beliefs so hard is because people don't like it when a hole appears in one of their big abstractions, right? So they've got these high order representations of the world that are shorthand ways of representing something. They're sort of like axioms of faith. And if a hole appears in one of their axioms of faith, then all this complexity comes rushing up, and it's overwhelming. And so people hate it when you undermine one of their high order abstractions. And so I think I told you this before, don't do that in relationships, right? It's best not to do it to yourself as well. I'll stop with this. These are medusas. And what happens when you see the medusa? Okay, so what might that mean? You bet, it's a prey response. And so that's the sort of thing that occurs when you're moving towards your goal in your frame, and the bottom drops out. It's like, oh, what's there? You don't know. So what's the logical first response? Well, if you're high neuroticism, it's going to be this. You're going to freeze. And then, and only then, if nothing else terrible happens to you, you'll start to relax a bit, and then maybe you'll start to investigate the structure of your plan, and maybe you'll start to investigate the structure of the world. And then From a constructivist perspective, say, once you start to do that, you gather information from the world, and then you remake your plan, and you remake your conception of the world, and then you could move on. So you do that under the guidance of the positive and the negative emotions. Okay, that's good. We'll see you Tuesday.
Good night, all of you, and I wish you a bright future. Good night.